The biggest divides in history didn't start with wars, they started with ideas. In this video, you're going to explore the philosophies that put civilizations in conflict, change the way we see the world, and split humanity between faith and reason, freedom and control, meaning and emptiness. From Plato and Aristotle to Confucius, Laozi, Nietzsche, and Marx. These thinkers didn't just reflect on the world, they reshaped it. Their ideas created opposite paths, eternal disagreements, and questions that still don't have clear answers. Get ready to dive into the philosophical currents that divided eras, cultures, and minds, because understanding these divides is understanding the very history of humanity, and maybe understanding yourself. At the heart of ancient Greece, two worldviews collided so strongly that their echoes still shape how we think, feel, and search for truth. On one side, Plato, student of Socrates, builds a philosophy that goes beyond the senses, claiming that reality isn't what we see but what only the mind can grasp. On the other side, Aristotle, his brightest student, breaks with the master and plants his feet firmly in the visible world, defending the idea that knowledge is born from direct experience with reality. This clash isn't just theoretical, it's a conflict between two ways of living, knowing, and existing. While Plato believed the senses deceive us, and that the soul must free itself from the body to reach truth, Aristotle valued observing the world, logic, biology, politics, everything that can be studied in this world, not in some invisible one. After watching Athens sink into political and moral crisis after Socrates' death, Plato lost faith in ordinary human judgment. For him, the Athenian democracy that condemned one of the greatest thinkers of all time was proof that truth can't be decided by majority vote. His philosophical answer was radical. The visible world is corrupted. True knowledge can only be reached by turning inward, toward the soul, where eternal forms, ideas, live. In works like The Republic, he describes the physical world as a pale shadow of the real one, the intelligible world. The famous allegory of the cave presented in that dialogue sums up his view. Humans live like prisoners, watching shadows on a wall and believing that's all there is. Breaking free from those chains is painful but necessary. Only by leaving the cave, a symbol of the world of the senses, can we see the light of the sun, that is, the truth of the ideas. For Plato then, philosophy is a path of elevation. It's not about studying nature as it appears, but about seeking essences, the good, justice, beauty. His method is dialectical, focused on introspection and pure reasoning. The philosopher, in this sense, is not an empirical scientist, but someone who purifies the soul to reach the highest kind of knowledge, the kind that never changes. Aristotle saw a problem in that. After inheriting Plato's academy, he studied his teacher's ideas deeply, but slowly moved away from his conclusion. For Aristotle, reality is right here, in the trees, animals, cities, and emotions. To deny the value of experience was, for him, to dismiss the very source of knowledge. In his work Metaphysics, he confronts Plato's theory of forms directly, arguing that there's no need to invent two separate worlds. Form exists in the thing itself. Aristotle doesn't deny that there are structures or essences, but they aren't floating somewhere else. They're in this world. A horse, for example, isn't just an imperfect copy of a form of horse, like Plato would say. For Aristotle, what defines a horse is built into the nature of the animal itself, its form and its function. His approach is concrete and investigative. He founded a new system of logic, the syllogism, and created some of the first systematic classifications of the natural world. His observations on biology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and metaphysics shaped centuries of thought. For him, knowledge starts with the senses, goes through memory, gets organized by reason, and then reaches an understanding of what is universal, but never apart from the physical world. This split also shows up in ethics. Plato believed the soul should align itself with the eternal order of the forms, especially the form of the good. Aristotle, on the other hand, builds an ethics of virtue grounded in practice and in the search for balance. In Nicomachean Ethics, he argues that a good life is one that fully realizes human nature, with moderation, courage, and practical wisdom. Virtue isn't given, it's built over time through habit and repeated choices. It's an ethic that feels very realistic and human. While Plato spoke mainly to the soul, Aristotle spoke to body and mind together. For Plato, the world is an obstacle. For Aristotle, it's a field full of things to discover. The difference also reaches politics. In the Republic, Plato sketches an ideal society ruled by philosophers, the only ones capable of knowing the good. It's a rigid, hierarchical utopia where each person has a fixed role. Aristotle, in Politics, studies different constitutions and says the best form of government depends on context, the social environment, the balance between classes, and concrete conditions. He looks for what's possible, not for a perfect abstract model. His politics is practical, comparative, and flexible. You can sum up this fundamental contrast like this. Plato was searching for the eternal. Aristotle focused on the concrete. Plato believed real knowledge demands going beyond the senses. Aristotle insisted that all knowledge begins with them. Plato raises thought to something almost divine. Aristotle brings it down to earth, turning it into a tool to understand the reality around us. Because of isso, ao longo da história, muitas correntes filosóficas penderam ora para ora para o outro. Christian theologians in the Middle Ages, like Augustine, drew heavily on Platonism to talk about the soul and God. Later, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas brought Aristotle back to center stage to unite reason and faith, pulling realism into Christian theology. Modern science, with figures like Galileo and Newton, is clearly Aristotelian in method. German idealism, with thinkers like Kant and Hegel, carries a deep Platonic inheritance. And even today, that clash is still alive. When you value theory more than practice, you're being Platonic. When you're suspicious of pretty ideas that ignore facts, you're being Aristotelian. When you look for some invisible truth behind appearances, you're thinking like Plato. When you believe you only really know by living, trying, failing, and learning, you're thinking like Aristotle. This split isn't just philosophical, it's existential. How many times do we feel torn between what is and what should be? Between the world as it is, messy and imperfect, and the world we imagine, just beautiful, ordered. Plato and Aristotle are like two voices inside each one of us. One invites you to look inward and beyond. The other invites you to look around, with sharp eyes and your feet on the ground. By getting to know them, we're not just studying philosophy, we're understanding two basic ways of being in the world, as people who are always searching for meaning, truth, and direction in the middle of life's uncertainty. In ancient China, during the turbulent era of the 100 schools of thought, two great teachers emerged with radically different answers to a single question. How should a human being live? In society or away from it? Confucius and Laozi, though they lived around the same time, looked at reality through opposite lenses. For one, virtue is built through tradition, social order, and ethical responsibility. For the other, wisdom is born from spontaneity, simplicity, and surrender to the natural flow of the universe. Confucius, whose Chinese name is Confucius, lived from 551 to 479 BCE in a China torn apart by wars between feudal states. He watched his homeland sink into chaos and corruption. His thinking is a direct response to that disorder. To restore harmony, it was necessary to reclaim the values of the ancestors: filial piety, respect for hierarchy, and an ethics of reciprocity. For him, morality wasn't just a personal choice, it was something built socially. His philosophy revolves around two key concepts: li, ritual, proper conduct, social etiquette, and ren, benevolence, humanity, compassion. Li keeps order, organizes social relationships, and guides behavior from small everyday gestures to the great rites of the state. Ren gives life to Li. keeping it from becoming empty or mechanical. For Confucius, virtue isn't inborn. It's learned, cultivated, and trained. A virtuous person doesn't show up ready-made. He's formed through example, study, and constant practice of what is right. His model of the ideal person is the yunzi, the superior man or noble person. Someone who doesn't chase material rewards, but lives with integrity, self-control, and a strong sense of duty. And that ideal isn't isolated. Confucius believed that if each person fulfilled their role with excellence, the father as father, the ruler as ruler, the child as child, society would fall into balance. Justice began in the family and then expanded outward into the empire. While Confucius preached order as the road to virtue, Laozi, or Lao Tzu, pointed in the opposite direction. His name literally means old master, and his life is wrapped in legend. Tradition says that, tired of the world, Laozi left civilization on the back of an ox and handed his teaching to a border guard in the form of a small but profound text, the Tao Te Ching. In just 81 short chapters, he laid out a wisdom that rejects human control, rigid rules, and artificial conventions. For Laozi, moral order shouldn't be imposed. True harmony doesn't come from laws or codes, but from living in line with the Tao, the way. The Tao isn't a god or a fixed concept. It's the impersonal principle that runs through all things. It's in the flow of water, in the turning of the seasons, in the way nature balances itself without effort. Laozi saw society as a deviation from that natural state. The more rules we create, the more artifice we add. The more laws we make, the more crimes appear. Civilization, in his eyes, creates the sickness it later pretends to cure. His central teaching is Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, not laziness or passivity, but acting without forcing, without going against the natural flow. A wise ruler, he says, governs by interfering as little as possible. A wise person lives simply, without chasing power or prestige. For Laozi, the strength of water, which overcomes everything without competing, is the perfect model of wisdom, adaptable, quiet, persistent. If Confucius wanted to restore the old order, Laozi seemed to want to dissolve every rigid structure. Where one saw the family as the foundation of morality, the other saw returning to nature as the path to freedom. One praised discipline, the other praised letting go. Confucianism believes in building ethics through social practice. Taoism trusts the spontaneity that appears when we drop the ego. This difference isn't just philosophical, it's spiritual. Confucianism is focused on the human world, relationships, obligations, politics. It's an ethical system that values social harmony, duty, and education. Taoism is cosmic. It looks at the universe as a living organism. For Laozi, the problem with the world is too much human interference, too much thinking, too much wanting, too much organizing. That's why the sage doesn't try to fix the world. He steps back, observes, and lets things follow their course. Despite their differences, both thinkers are chasing the same goal: harmony. But they walk opposite paths. Confucius believes social peace comes from shaping character through rituals, responsibilities, and respect. Laozi believes inner peace comes from dropping those very structures. One wants to transform the world through moral effort. The other wants us to drop the idea of transforming it. The impact of these two philosophies on Chinese culture has been deep and long-lasting. For centuries, Confucianism was the official ideology of the state. Rulers were trained in Confucian classics, and the imperial system rested on a logic of hierarchy, respect, and shared responsibility. Taoism, in turn, shaped spiritual practices, traditional medicine, martial arts, poetry, and even aesthetics. One gave China its political framework, the other gave it spiritual depth. Their contradictions are still alive today. When we debate whether ethics should be taught or whether it grows naturally, we're revisiting that clash. When we wrestle with the question of whether to follow strict rules or live more authentically, we're reliving the tension between Confucius and Laozi. If a young person asks, "How should I live?" Confucius would answer, Learn from the ancients, do your duty, respect others, practice virtue. Laozi would say, let go of your cravings, watch nature, quiet your mind, flow with the Tao. This contrast also shows up in how we think about power. For Confucius, good government demands moral excellence. A leader must be educated, just, and wise. For Laozi, the best government is the one that governs the least. A wise leader is almost invisible, letting people live in peace without constant interference. What's interesting is that Chinese culture never fully chose one side over the other. Instead of rejecting one and embracing only the other, it absorbed both. Confucius and Laozi, despite their differences, became complementary. Like yin and yang, they represent opposite forces that together create balance. Maybe that's the biggest lesson we can learn from this contrast. We don't always have to choose between order or freedom, structure or flow. There are times when we need Confucian discipline, repetition, effort, commitment, and there are times when we need Taoist letting go, releasing control, stepping back, listening to the quiet movement of life. In that sense, wisdom doesn't mean picking a side, but recognizing that both visions speak to us. Every day, we live between duty and flow. Some days, we need to be Confucius. On others, we need to be Laozi. In the search for freedom from suffering, two of humanity's oldest spiritual traditions offer different, yet deeply connected paths. Hinduism and Buddhism share historical, cultural, and conceptual roots. Both were born in the ancient soil of India, but between them there's a crucial difference: the nature of the self. Hinduism teaches that there is an Atman, an eternal self, an unchanging essence that is one with the divine. Buddhism, in contrast, breaks with this idea and presents anatta, the no self, or the absence of any permanent, unchanging self. This isn't just a technical disagreement. It completely changes how we see life, suffering, freedom, and even death. Hinduism, with its many schools and traditions, starts from the idea that behind all the changing layers of our identity, body, thoughts, emotions, desires, there is something eternal, the Atman. That Atman is, in essence, identical to Brahman, the supreme reality, the ultimate ground behind all appearances. Tat Tvam Asi, you are that, is one of the great declarations of the Upanishads, the philosophical texts at the core of Vedantic Hinduism. This teaching says the true self is not what suffers, changes, or dies. Atman is pure, formless, untouched by time. Ignorance, according to Hindu thought, comes from identifying ourselves with what is impermanent: the body, the mind, the personality. The path to liberation, moksha, is to wake up from this confusion and break the cycle of rebirth, samsara, by realizing that, at the deepest level, we are the divine itself. Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, in the 6th century BCE, appears in dialogue with this tradition, but also in sharp criticism of it. After years of intense spiritual search, the Buddha concluded that the root of suffering is attachment, and that attachment comes from the illusion of a solid, permanent self. So one of the central marks of his teaching is the rejection of Atman. For Buddhism, everything that makes up a human being, body, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, is in constant flux. There is no fixed entity that can truly be called I. What we call self is just a convenient label we put on a process that is always changing. This is anatta, the insight that there is no permanent, independent self at the core of our experience. This can feel pretty unsettling. After all, it feels like there's a me in here observing, deciding, wanting. But according to Buddhist teaching, that feeling is an illusion. And it's exactly that illusion that keeps us stuck in suffering. Liberation, called nirvana, happens when this illusion dissolves. When you deeply see that there is no solid owner of the pain has nowhere to fully stick. In practice, these views create very different spiritual paths. In Hinduism, meditation, ritual, devotion, and study of scripture are ways to reconnect with your divine essence. The seeker is invited to go beyond the ego and discover the Atman that is one with Brahman. Liberation is a return to what you always were, but forgot, pure, timeless consciousness. In Buddhism, the path is the Noble Eightfold Path: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. The practitioner carefully observes the processes of the mind without clinging until it becomes clear there is no fixed self behind them. Consciousness is not a solid thing. It's a stream of events. Enlightenment doesn't come from finding some eternal core inside you, but from dropping the search for a permanent center altogether. Both traditions talk about samsara, the cycle of rebirth, pain, and illusion. But where Hinduism sees a soul that moves from body to body, Buddhism sees only a flow of karmic cause and effect, with no permanent someone underneath it all. It's like one candle lighting another. There's continuity, but not the same exact flame. Hinduism offers comfort by saying, there is something in you that can't be destroyed. Buddhism confronts the ego more directly. There is nothing solid to cling to, and that is your freedom. Historically, this sparked fierce philosophical debates. Hindu masters accused Buddhists of nihilism, of denying the value of self and life. Buddhists, in turn, saw the idea of Atman as a subtle form of attachment, the ego trying to make itself eternal. The Buddha himself avoided getting stuck in abstract metaphysical debates about an immortal soul, not because he had no opinion, but because he believed those questions didn't help end suffering. He compared it to a man shot by an arrow who refuses treatment until he knows who shot it, what the arrow is made of, and so on. The point is, first, pull out the arrow. Despite the disagreements, there's a lot of overlap. Both traditions say ordinary life is marked by suffering, dukkha, and that it's possible to go beyond it. Both value meditation, compassion, and letting go. Both say liberation doesn't come from chasing pleasure or worldly success, but from a deep inner transformation. These views are still very alive today. In the West, many people approach Buddhism in a more psychological way. Mindfulness meditation, for example, comes from Buddhist right mindfulness, paying attention to the present moment with non-judgmental awareness. Hinduism, especially through yoga, offers a path of reconnecting with the sacred within, with the idea that each person carries a divine spark inside. There's also a deeply existential side to this whole debate. In an age of identity crises, anxiety, and constant searching for meaning, the question, "Who am I?" hits hard. Hinduism responds, "You are the eternal, the infinite, the divine in human form." Buddhism responds, "You are impermanence, flow, emptiness." And precisely because of that, you're free. Both answers are powerful. One offers rootedness, the other, openness. One feels like fullness, the other, like space. One invites you to merge with the all, the other, to let go of the idea of I altogether. But in different ways, both invite us to go beyond the illusion of separation and move toward a deeper awareness of reality. When someone is suffering, Hinduism might say, "This suffering is not what you truly are. You are Atman, unchanging, whole." Buddhism might say, "Look closely at the suffering, watch it arise and pass away. See that there is no fixed owner behind it." The first points us to what is eternal in us. The second points us to emptiness as liberation. Maybe the most striking thing is this. Even though they look completely opposite, these views don't have to cancel each other out. Many modern teachers, like Ramana Maharshi in the Hindu tradition and Thich Nhat Hanh in the Buddhist one, hint at a kind of integration. The self needs to be transcended, they say. But that transcendence can be experienced as fullness or as emptiness, two ways of describing the same depth from different angles. In the end, whether through the silent presence of an eternal Atman or through the freedom of anatta and no self, the call is the same. Wake up. Wake up from ignorance, from clinging, from identifying with what you are not, and walk, step by step, toward freedom. At the heart of Christian theology, a clash emerged that wasn't just about salvation, but about human nature itself. It was the 4th century, and the now Christian Roman Empire was trying to organize its faith into clear doctrines. In that context, two thinkers went head-to-head, not with weapons, but with ideas that would split the history of the Church and echo for centuries: Augustine of Hippo and Pelagius. The disagreement between them ran deep. For Augustine, no one could be saved by their own merit. Humanity, marked by original sin, was spiritually dead, and only God's grace, freely given, could bring someone back to life. Pelagius, on the other hand, believed human beings had not lost their ability to choose what is good. Moral freedom was real, human effort mattered, salvation required responsibility. This tension between grace and will isn't just a doctrinal issue, it's an existential question. What really shapes who we are? Our effort or God's will? Are we free to become better, or are we dependent on divine mercy? Augustine was born in 354 in North Africa and spent much of his youth drowning in doubts, pleasures, and non-Christian philosophies. He studied rhetoric, was drawn to Manichaeism, and lived complicated relationships until his powerful conversion to Christianity. That inner turmoil shaped his thinking. He knew, from experience, the strength of disordered desire, what he called concupiscence, and came to argue that without God's intervention, a person isn't even capable of truly desiring the good. For Augustine, Adam and Eve's fall wasn't just a moral mistake, it was an ontological disaster. From that point on, everyone is born inclined toward evil, with a damaged will. Human freedom still exists, but it's enslaved by sin. The only way out is God's grace, an undeserved, overpowering, transforming gift. Grace doesn't just forgive, it recreates the person. You can feel this in his most famous work, Confessions, where he prays, "Give what you command, and then command whatever you will." Augustine is saying, the human being needs God even to obey God. Everything starts with God's initiative. No act of goodness is truly our own merit. It's grace acting first, carrying and guiding the soul. Pelagius, a British monk who arrived in Rome around 380, saw something different. He looked at Christians around him and saw people using weakness as an excuse. "I can't help it. I'm sinful. The flesh is too strong." For him, that attitude was unacceptable. He preached that God, being just, would never command something we are incapable of doing. If God calls us to holiness, it's because we can be holy. Human beings, with their reason and will still intact, are capable of choosing the good. Pelagius didn't deny grace, but he thought of it more as external help, the example of Christ, the teachings of Scripture, the encouragement of the Christian community. Grace inspires us, but doesn't override us. The core of his theology was moral responsibility. For him, saying "I can't avoid sin" was just a sophisticated excuse, laziness dressed up as humility. Augustine was deeply disturbed by this. In his view, Pelagius reduced grace to almost nothing and brought back a kind of salvation by works. If a person can reach perfection by their own effort, where does the cross of Christ fit in? What's the meaning of redemption? For Augustine, Pelagius made the mistake of putting the human being at the center, and that for him was pride. The debate escalated, gained followers, stirred church councils, and produced letters, treatises, and official church statements. Pelagius was eventually condemned as a heretic at the Council of Carthage in 418. His doctrine was officially rejected, and Augustine's theology became dominant in Western Christianity, heavily shaping Catholic thought and later influencing the key ideas of the Protestant Reformation. But the issue never really went away. Even with Pelagius condemned, his concern about human freedom and moral effort kept resurfacing. The question stays alive. If everything depends on God, what's left for us to do? If grace is irresistible, why are some saved and others not? For Augustine, the answer is tough. Grace is part of God's mysterious choice. God, in his sovereignty, grants salvation to whom he wills, not because of merit, but because of free and undeserved love. This leads to the idea of predestination, which theologians like Calvin would later double down on during the Reformation. Some see this as a denial of human freedom. Others see it as a radical expression of God's mercy. Pelagius, on the other hand, stands as a defender of human dignity and choice. His emphasis on responsibility echoes in every tradition that values moral effort, spiritual discipline, and the possibility of becoming better through practice. He reminded people that when Christ said, "Be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect," he was talking to real human beings, not spiritual superheroes. For Pelagius, faith without action was empty. The implications of this clash go way beyond theology. They touch psychology, ethics, and politics. Today, the tension between Augustine and Pelagius shows up in questions like, is human nature basically good or bent toward evil? Are we truly responsible for our choices, or mostly shaped by circumstances and deep limitations? Should we put our hope in inner transformation or in external effort and change? In therapy and self-help, a more Pelagian mindset appears in the idea that each person can transform themselves, that the past doesn't fully determine the future, and personal responsibility is key to healing. A more Augustinian outlook shows up in views that see human nature as deeply conflicted and wounded, that recognize destructive impulses and the need for something greater than our own will to put us back together. In social and political struggles, these views also show up. Some argue that structural change happens through collective effort, discipline, and intentional action, a kind of Pelagian faith in moral progress. Others insist that only a deeper spiritual awakening, something that comes from beyond us or above us, can break the invisible chains we carry. An Augustinian echo. Maybe the most moving part of all this is how each side speaks to different human experiences. Augustine's theology, even though it feels harsher, offers comfort to the broken. It says, even if you're shattered, lost, and ruined inside, there is hope. Not because you are strong, but because God is. Pelagius's perspective, even though it demands more, is empowering. It says, you do have the ability to get up, to start over, to do what is right. Grace and freedom stay in tension, and maybe they always will. In the end, real wisdom might be in recognizing the depth of that tension. Augustine reminds us that we are not completely in control of ourselves, that we depend on something beyond our own willpower and intelligence. Pelagius reminds us that we're not puppets, that every real change still asks for choice, effort, and responsibility from us. In the Middle Ages, faith and reason were often seen as opposing forces, like two different lights shining on reality from conflicting angles. But there was a moment in history when these two powers, religion and philosophy, collided so deeply that they split schools, churches, courts, and consciences. At the center of that clash stood two giants, Averroes, the Muslim philosopher from Cordoba, and Thomas Aquinas, the Christian theologian who reshaped the thinking of the Catholic Church. Both wrote under the enormous shadow of Aristotle. Both wanted to understand the world with clarity, but their starting points and their conclusions reveal two very different ways of seeking truth, one that lifts reason up as the highest authority, and another that tries to harmonize reason with the dogmas of Christian faith. Averroes, or Ibn Rushd as he was known in the Islamic world, was born in 1126 in Cordoba, in what is now Spain. A doctor, jurist, and philosopher, he lived in a world where Greek culture, Islamic science, and politics were deeply intertwined. His intellectual mission was clear: to claim Aristotle as the ultimate guide for human reason. But what he did was more radical than it might sound. In a context of growing religious orthodoxy in Islam, Averroes argued that philosophical reason wasn't just compatible with faith, it was superior to the popular religious understanding of the masses. For him, there were three levels of understanding truth: the level of common faith, meant for those without philosophical training; the level of theological argument, used by scholars, and the level of rational demonstration, accessible only to philosophers. In that framework, reason sits at the top. It's the purest and hardest on path to knowing God and reality. His reading of Aristotle was bold. He interpreted Aristotle as defending the eternity of the world, an idea that directly contradicted the Islamic and Christian belief that the world was created by God at a specific moment. Averroes claimed there was no real contradiction between faith and philosophy, only apparent ones. When conflicts seemed to appear, religious texts should be read allegorically. Reason, he insisted, should not be sacrificed in the name of faith. That stance put him on a collision course with more conservative Muslim theologians like al-Ghazali, who argued that certain mysteries of faith are beyond reason, and that trying to fully grasp them philosophically was spiritual arrogance. Averroes was persecuted. Some of his works were banned, and he ended his life politically isolated. But his ideas did not die with him. While much of the Islamic world gradually closed itself off to Aristotelian rationalism, Christian Europe, especially the medieval scholastic tradition, was rediscovering Aristotle through Arabic translations, many produced in the Iberian Peninsula. That's how Averroes, ironically, became the main conduit for Aristotle's thought into the Christian world. His commentaries reached medieval universities and caused a stir. Many Christian thinkers, known as Latin Averroists, began adopting his view of reason as something autonomous from faith. It was in this environment that Thomas Aquinas appeared, born in 1225 in Italy. A Dominican friar, brilliant and methodical, he studied in Paris and Naples and devoted himself to the massive task of reconciling Christian teaching with Aristotelian reason. But unlike the Latin Averroists who praised Averroes, Aquinas saw real dangers in radically separating faith and reason. For Aquinas, reason was a gift from God, a natural light given so humans could know the truth. But that light had limits. Some truths could be reached by reason alone, like the existence of God according to him. But others, such as the Trinity or the incarnation of Christ, could only be known through revelation. Faith, therefore, wasn't against reason, but it stood above it. In his masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, Thomas lays out a harmonious model. Philosophy serves theology the way reason serves faith. He doesn't reject Aristotle. In fact, he turns him into an ally, but he filters Aristotle through a Christian lens. That's why Aquinas rejects Averroes' claim that the world is eternal, and he also fights the idea of double truth, the notion that something could be true for reason and false for faith, or the opposite. For Thomas, there is only one truth, and it must be sought with humility, using both sources, reason and revelation. The clash between these two visions was intense. Averroes, with his hierarchy where philosophy is the highest form of truth, collided with the Christian doctrine of humility before divine mystery. Aquinas, by placing faith as the crown of reason, tried to protect the supernatural core of Christianity. One saw the philosopher as the true interpreter of the divine. The other saw the philosopher as a servant who prepares the way for faith. Not everyone accepted the synthesis Thomas Aquinas was proposing. Some feared that using pagan philosophy would corrupt the purity of Christian faith. Others thought rational theology threatened the mystery at the heart of belief. And even within Averroes' legacy, there were tensions. How do you defend a personal God if pure reason seems to point to an impersonal necessary cause like in Aristotle's system? At the deepest level, the tension between faith and reason is a tension between two ways of seeking the absolute. Faith throws itself into what can't be seen. Reason pursues what can be demonstrated. Faith asks for surrender. Reason asks for independence. Faith starts from revelation. Reason starts from doubt. But both are after the same thing: truth. That old dispute is still with us. In the modern world, the heirs of Averroes argue that science and philosophy should operate with full autonomy, without religious interference. The heirs of Aquinas argue that reason, without some spiritual foundation, risks becoming cold, nihilistic, or destructive. Today, when we argue about the limits of science, the role of religion in public life, the nature of consciousness, or the origin of the universe, the debate between Averroes and Aquinas quietly returns. When someone says, "Reason can't explain everything," Aquinas is echoing. When someone insists, "Religion must submit to reason," Averroes is speaking. The synthesis Thomas Aquinas offered eventually became official Catholic doctrine, especially after the Council of Trent. Averroes, meanwhile, was pushed to the margins of the Islamic world, but became a central figure in the history of Western philosophy. Two men, two traditions, two worlds, united by Aristotle, but divided by how they understood humanity's place before the truth. In the end, both Averroes and Thomas Aquinas believed reality is knowable and that seeking truth is a sacred duty, but they disagreed on the path. One saw reason as the queen, the other as a faithful servant. And somewhere between those two extremes, humanity is still trying to find balance. At the start of the 16th century, Europe still lived under the weight of a church that held not only spiritual power, but also political and economic control. According to official doctrine, the salvation of souls was in the hands of the church hierarchy, with the Pope as Christ's representative on earth. Most believers had no direct access to the scriptures. Mass was in Latin. Theology was a privilege of a few, and salvation was often presented as something that could be mediated, negotiated, or even bought. It was in this context that Martin Luther appeared, an Augustinian monk and theology professor at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. His revolt wasn't just against administrative abuses in the church. It was a spiritual break with a system that, in his view, had lost the center of the gospel. In 1517, when he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, Luther was not only attacking a specific practice, the sale of indulgences, but the entire structure of mediation between God and human beings that the Catholic Church had built over the centuries. The sale of indulgences, promoted by preachers like Johann Tetzel, promised the shortening of purgatory in exchange for money. This shocked Luther, who knew scripture and Augustinian theology in depth. For him, salvation was a free gift of God's grace, received by faith, not by works, and definitely not by payments. From there came one of the central ideas of the Reformation, sola fide, faith alone. But Luther didn't stop there. If faith was the only path to justification, and if that faith had to be grounded in the Word of God, then that word needed to be available to everyone. That's why Luther defended another explosive idea, sola scriptura, scripture alone, so. The final authority for Christian doctrine doesn't lie in councils, oral tradition, or papal decrees. It lies in the Bible, and every believer has the right and the responsibility to read it for themselves. The Reformation, then, broke not only with specific doctrines, but with an entire structure of religious mediation. The Pope, the bishops, the sacraments as exclusive channels of grace. All of that was put on the table. Salvation started to be understood as a direct personal relationship between the individual and God. The priest was no longer a necessary middleman. The believer became responsible for their own faith. The Catholic Church's response was harsh and quick. Luther was summoned to the Diet of Worms in 1521 and ordered to recant. He refused. His words still echo today. Unless I am convinced by the scriptures and by plain reason, I cannot and will not recant. May God help me. Amen. With that stance, Luther put himself not only against the Pope, but against an entire 1,000-year-old system of religious authority. He was excommunicated, declared a heretic and outlaw, but by then, his message had already spread like wildfire. The Protestant Reformation wasn't only a theological event, it was a turning point in history, culture, politics, and spirituality. It broke the religious unity of the West, sparked wars, persecutions, and counter-reforms, and at the same time opened the door for new forms of religiosity, the rise of modern nations, and the growing value placed on individual conscience. Direct reading of the Bible, defended by Luther, pushed literacy forward. He himself translated the Bible into German, helping create a common written language and unifying the tongue. Free examination of Scripture led to a multiplication of interpretations and, inevitably, to the birth of many different Protestant denominations, each with its own emphasis, liturgy, and doctrine. It's important to remember Luther never intended to create a permanent split. His original goal was to reform the Church from within, cleaning it from what he saw as corruption. But by challenging papal authority and established dogmas, he hit deep nerves, and there was no going back. For Luther, salvation could not be controlled by any religious system. It was a sovereign act of God's grace. The human being, marked by original sin, was incapable of saving themselves by their own merit. Here, he's close to Augustine's theology, which sees grace as the only source of redemption. But Luther went a step further. He broke with the idea that this grace had to be channeled through the Church. Grace was free. Faith was enough. The Catholic Church, in turn, responded strongly. At the Council of Trent, 1545–1563, it reaffirmed its traditional doctrines, condemned Reformation ideas, and launched the Counter-Reformation. Catholic teaching began to stress even more the authority of tradition, the importance of the sacraments, the indispensable role of the priesthood, and the need for both faith and works in salvation. More than just a theological dispute, the clash between Luther and the Church reflected two ways of understanding religious experience. One based on collective historical authority, the other on individual conscience. One that saw faith as something lived inside a sacramental community, the other as an inner, personal, non-transferable act. This fight also redefined the role of authority itself by saying that every Christian could and should interpret the Bible. Luther started a process that placed individual conscience above blind obedience. That had consequences far beyond religion. Modern thought, with its emphasis on freedom, personal responsibility, and criticism of institutions, owes a lot to the Reformation. Of course, this new freedom brought new problems. Without a unifying center, Protestantism fragmented quickly. Calvin, Zwingli, the Anabaptists, the Puritans, each proposed their own reading of the Christian faith. If Luther freed faith from the church structure, he also created a new problem: who's interpreting Scripture correctly? If everyone has access, how do you avoid theological chaos? The Catholic Church, for its part, began to stress better training for clergy, founded orders like the Jesuits to fight religious ignorance and win hearts and minds back. While reaffirming its doctrine, it also started to reform its own internal excesses. The clash between Martin Luther and the Catholic Church wasn't just a fight between personal faith and church authority. It was a redefinition of what it means to be Christian. Luther broke with the idea of a faith controlled from above and handed back to the individual the weight and the gift of seeking God with their own hands, eyes, and heart. That tension is still alive today. When someone says they don't need priests or pastors to have a relationship with God, they're speaking with Luther's voice. When someone looks to tradition, the communion of saints, and the sacraments as their path to salvation, they're walking in the echo of the church that answered that German monk. Between personal faith and tradition, between freedom and doctrine, modern Christianity still carries the marks of a break that was never fully healed, but that also opened new possibilities for living faith with depth, awareness, and real commitment. The way a society understands human nature shapes how it builds its laws, its education, its politics, and even its dreams. That's why the philosophical clash between Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes is not just a theoretical debate. It's a mirror we look into, as individuals and as a civilization. Both thought deeply about human nature and the social contract, but they arrived at completely opposite conclusions. For Hobbes, the human being in a state of nature is violent, selfish, and driven mainly by self-interest. For Rousseau, the human being is born good. It's society that corrupts him. These two views don't just disagree, they describe different worlds. Hobbes writes in the middle of the English Civil War, watching chaos, instability, and raw brutality up close. Rousseau writes in Enlightenment-era France, attacking social inequality, the fake virtues of the elite, and the artificial lifestyle of modern society. One fears disorder, the other fears oppression. In Leviathan, 1651, Hobbes builds his theory on a clear premise. In the state of nature, before any kind of state exists, people live in constant insecurity. Each person is a potential enemy of the other because everyone wants the same things: safety, food, power, prestige. In that world, life is, in Hobbes's famous words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This dark view isn't random. Hobbes believed that human beings are, at their core, driven by selfish passions. Fear of death and the hunger for power are the main forces behind our behavior. Without a higher authority to set limits, the world falls into chaos. His solution? The social contract. To escape this miserable condition, individuals agree to give up part of their natural freedom and hand over power to a sovereign, the Leviathan, who rules with absolute authority. That sovereign can be a monarch, a parliament, or any form of government capable of keeping order. But its power has to be unquestioned. For Hobbes, freedom only exists inside order. Without a strong state, there is no civilization. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his work The Social Contract, 1762, starts from a radically different premise. He rejects the idea that humans are naturally bad. For him, the human being is born good, sensitive, and empathetic. What ruins this goodness is not nature, but society. In his famous idea of the noble savage, Rousseau describes primitive man as someone who is free, self-sufficient, and guided by a natural sense of pity, an instinctive compassion for the suffering of others. But as society develops, private property appears, along with pride, inequality, and competition. The person who was once simple and free becomes vain, selfish, and alienated. The so-called civilized state for Rousseau is an invisible chain that traps people in conventions, hypocrisy, and artificial hierarchies. Rousseau's proposal is also a social contract, but with a different goal. Instead of creating a Leviathan to control human impulses, Rousseau talks about the general will, a political body in which each citizen, by obeying the laws, is obeying themselves as part of the community. The true social pact for him is not submission to power, but active participation in building a shared freedom. Here's the key contrast. For Hobbes, the state protects humans from themselves. For Rousseau, the state should free humans from the corruption of an unequal society. One sees government as a brake, the other as an expression of the collective will. One starts from fear, the other from hope. This clash doesn't stay in the philosophy classroom. It echoes today in our political choices, in how we judge human behavior, and in how we design education. When public safety policies assume that people are deep down dangerous, we're hearing Hobbes. When we bet on education as a tool for moral and social transformation, we're hearing Rousseau. It's important to see that Rousseau wasn't naive. He wasn't calling for a literal return to the wilderness. He knew civilization is here to stay. His critique was aimed at how civilization was built, on privilege, domination, and oppression. He believed it was possible to rebuild society on fairer, more natural foundations. His philosophy is, at its core, a call for moral and political renewal. Hobbes, though often seen as pessimistic, wasn't simply defending plain tyranny. He just believed that without a sovereign power, peace becomes impossible. His philosophy is realistic and pragmatic, focused on protecting life above all else. If the price of peace is submission, he thinks it's worth paying. Rousseau, on the other hand, believed that true freedom requires more than security. It demands participation, virtue, and a commitment to the common good. He believed in the possibility of active, ethical citizenship, capable of rising above private egoism for the sake of the general will. This tension runs through modern history. Hobbes is the father of the centralized modern state, of the idea that power is legitimate when it guarantees order. Rousseau is the inspiration behind revolutions for freedom, equality, and popular democracy. Hobbes leads toward a security-first liberalism, Rousseau toward republican idealism, and what's most striking is that both are, in some way, right, and both are incomplete. There are moments when human impulses show their cruelest face, exactly as Hobbes warned. But there are also spontaneous acts of solidarity, just as Rousseau believed. Some societies only function with strong authority, others thrive on citizen participation. The question that remains is, which view of human nature do we choose as the foundation for our institutions? Hobbes warns us, don't romanticize human nature. Peace needs rules, and rules need power. Rousseau answers, be careful with power built on fear. It can pull us away from real freedom. Hobbes would say, freedom without security is an illusion. Rousseau would reply, security without freedom is just another kind of prison. This philosophical battle is, deep down, a spiritual one. It forces us to look inside ourselves. Who do we believe we are, at our core? Fallen beings who need to be restrained, or free beings who need to be educated? The way we answer that question shapes our world. Schools that treat students as rebels by nature lean toward a Hobbesian approach. Schools that trust children's curiosity and autonomy lean toward Rousseau. Policies that prioritize social control strengthen the logic of the Leviathan. Policies that invest in inclusion, participation, and social justice walk alongside the noble savage. In the end, human beings might be both, wolf and innocent. Society can lift us up or drag us down. Politics can protect us or dominate us. The challenge is to find a balance between the forces inside us, without denying either one. The modern world was shaped in the clash between two opposite visions. On one side, the liberal belief that individual freedom, private property, and free markets are the keys to progress. On the other, Karl Marx's revolutionary critique, which saw capitalism as a machine of exploitation, producing inequality and alienation. When dialectical materialism confronts free market ideology, the clash between Marx and liberal capitalism becomes more than a theory fight. It turns into the main ideological battle of the last 2 centuries. At the heart of liberal thought is the idea that human beings are rational, free agents, capable of pursuing their own interests in the market. When each person goes after their own well-being, thinkers like Adam Smith said, the common good ends up being promoted by an invisible hand. The market becomes a kind of spontaneous regulator of the economy, with no need for heavy state control. Liberal capitalism is built on this vision, an economic system based on free enterprise, competition, and private ownership of the means of production. Karl Marx, however, saw a deep illusion in this supposed freedom. For him, the free market doesn't liberate, it hides power and domination. The worker seems to sell their labor voluntarily, but in reality is trapped in a system they don't control. What Marx exposes is that behind the legal freedom of the labor contract, there's a structural inequality. The worker doesn't own the means of production, and therefore has to sell their own life energy in exchange for a wage that never matches the real value they create. This is the core of his critique of surplus value, the extra value created by labor that is taken by the capitalist. For Marx, this isn't an accident, it's the essence of capitalism. Exploitation is not a bug in the system, it's the engine that makes it run. While liberalism sees capital as the result of merit and individual initiative, Marx sees it as historical accumulation based on expropriation and violence. From the enclosure of common lands in England to the brutal colonization of entire peoples. What really sets Marx apart from the liberals is not just what he says, but how he analyzes reality. Dialectical materialism. Influenced by Hegel, Marx argues that history is not driven by ideas alone, but by concrete material conflicts, especially class conflict. Marx's dialectic sees the world as always moving, pushed forward by internal contradictions that tend to explode and reshape the system. In that sense, capitalism, though revolutionary compared to feudalism, carries its own built-in contradictions: growing concentration of wealth, crises of overproduction, exploitation of labor, and human alienation. These contradictions can't be solved with small reforms. They demand a complete overcoming of the system, or, as Marx would say, a revolution, the working class taking control of the means of production and building a classless society based on common ownership. The liberal view, in contrast, claims that capitalism's problems can be fixed from within the system itself, with more competition, technological innovation, social mobility, and political freedom. The belief is that economic growth, driven by markets, will eventually raise the standard of living for everyone. Liberals are suspicious of a heavy interventionist state and see excessive regulation as a threat to individual freedom. Marx was deeply skeptical of that promise. To him, capitalism is not just unfair, it's unstable and self-destructive. Boom and bust cycles, the endless chase for profit, wage cuts, and replacing workers with machines would, in his view, eventually lead to the system collapsing on its own. The working class, organized and aware of its exploitation, would become the historical force that transforms society. But history didn't follow Marx's script exactly. Capitalism turned out to be more resilient than he expected. It absorbed reforms, created welfare states, developed new technologies, and managed, at least in part, to raise living standards in rich countries. The communist revolutions of the 20th century, like those in the Soviet Union and China, waved the Marxist flag, but often resulted in authoritarian regimes, far from the human emancipation Marx imagined. Still, his critique is very much alive. In an age of extreme inequality, precarious work, environmental crisis, and the financialization of everyday life, Marxist ideas are being revisited and debated again. His structural analysis of the system, his denunciation of alienation, and his call for class consciousness still hit a nerve. Liberal capitalism, even as the dominant model, also faces serious crises of legitimacy. Many people ask whether a system built on the logic of profit can really handle the existential challenges of the 21st century, like environmental destruction, mass automation, and global inequality. Free markets, so celebrated by liberals, are now questioned when people see that freedom doesn't always mean fairness and can easily end up concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few. But there are nuances on both sides. Inside liberalism, there are attempts to blend markets with social justice, like social liberalism, which defends markets but supports public policies to reduce inequality. Inside Marxism, there have been more open, democratic strands, like humanist Marxism and the Frankfurt School, which tried to combine social criticism with respect for individual rights. The tension between Marx and liberal capitalism is not just about economics, it's about worldviews. It's about what it really means to be free. For liberals, freedom is the ability to choose where to work, what to buy, what to create. For Marx, that freedom is fake if a person is alienated, living under the pressure of material need, and working not to realize themselves, but to enrich someone else. It's also a tension about the role of the individual in history. For liberalism, the individual is the main driver of progress. For Marx, it's the collective, the class, that moves history. Change doesn't come from the will of a few special people, but from the struggle between groups with opposing interests. This battle is still going. When we see strikes, movements for social justice, and protests against inequality, there's an echo of Marx's cry against exploitation. When we hear speeches in defense of individual initiative, economic freedom, and entrepreneurship, the liberal spirit is clearly alive. Each side lifts up a core value, freedom and equality, but the two rarely walk together without friction. Maybe the real question for us is this: can we bring the best of these two worlds together? A market that's free, but respects the dignity of work. A society that promotes equality without crushing freedom. The clash between Marx and liberal capitalism has no final answer, because it reflects the tension inside us between the desire to be free and the desire to live in a just world. And maybe, by really understanding that clash, we can start imagining paths we haven't tried yet. Two military thinkers, separated by centuries and by almost opposite cultures, help define what it means to think about war. not just as destruction, but as art, politics, philosophy, and wisdom. Sun Tzu, a Chinese general and strategist from the 5th century BC, wrote The Art of War, a timeless work that became a reference not only for soldiers, but also for diplomats, business leaders, and all kinds of decision-makers. Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian general from the 19th century, wrote On War, a dense analytical work that shaped modern Western military thought. Both studied conflict, but they saw war through completely different lenses. Sun Tzu, influenced by Taoist thinking, starts from a worldview based on harmony with nature, non-resistance, flexibility, and sensitivity to invisible forces. His most famous principle says it all. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. For him, the ideal victory is gained through intelligence, deterrence, and deception, not through physical destruction. When war actually happens, it's already a kind of failure. Clausewitz, in contrast, defines war as the continuation of politics by other means. In his view, war is a legitimate tool of the state, a rational way to pursue political goals. There is no shame in violence if it serves a clear political purpose. War, for him, is a field where reason and passion collide, a duel on a grand scale where each side tries to impose its will on the other. This contrast reflects more than just two styles of thinking. It's the meeting of two very different philosophical worlds. Sun Tzu sees reality as a flow. Nothing is fixed. Everything is always changing. Like water flowing around rocks, the wise strategist adapts to circumstances, acts quietly, avoids direct confrontation, and looks for the path of least resistance. Clausewitz, on the other hand, comes from a more Western, rational, almost Cartesian mindset. War is a direct clash of forces, where strategic calculation must be paired with courage, discipline, and strict organization. From Sun Tzu's Taoist point of view, the best general is the one who knows himself and his enemy, who pays attention to the seasons, the winds, the terrain, and the morale of the opposing army. He doesn't act on impulse, but on careful calculation. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Victory doesn't come from brute force, but from wisdom, and especially from quiet preparation. The war is won before it starts. Clausewitz, on the other hand, sees war as an act of human will, a clash of physical and moral forces where friction, the unpredictable element that disrupts any plan, demands leadership and firmness. He recognizes the chaos and randomness of war, but insists on the importance of a clear political goal, centralized command, and the total mobilization of a nation's resources. War is not a subtle art, but a strategic science. While Sun Tzu invites the strategist to practice Wu Wei, non-action, meaning acting without forcing, moving with the rhythm of circumstances, Clausewitz calls for determination, direction, and structure. In a sense, Clausewitz represents the modern view of war, technological, institutional, and tied to the state. Sun Tzu represents a pre-modern approach, where the focus is more on the leader's mind and spirit than on weapons or numbers. In Sun Tzu's work, the battlefield is the very last option. The most effective victory is the one that breaks the enemy's will before blood is spilled. The victory that makes the enemy give up before fighting. That's why he values espionage, disinformation, and the use of terrain and timing as key allies. Conflict should be avoided if possible. Destruction should be minimal. A good leader doesn't chase glory. He aims for stability. Clausewitz, in contrast, accepts that direct confrontation is often inevitable. For him, war naturally tends toward absolute war, the maximum use of force to break the enemy's resistance. He says there is a natural escalation in conflict, where each side reacts to the other with more intensity until violence reaches its peak. The only thing that can limit this tendency is politics. The state's rational goals must control the destructive energy of war. The tension between these two views shows up in many political and military decisions even today. When a country chooses economic sanctions, quiet negotiations, or covert influence, we can hear Sun Tzu's echo. When it chooses invasions, occupations, and conventional war, we hear Clausewitz. When the goal is to win without fighting, by operating in the shadows, using information, psychological strategy, and influence, we're in Sun Tzu's world. When war is formally declared, with troop mobilizations and clear political objectives, we're in Clausewitz's territory. It's also a clash between long-term and short-term thinking. Sun Tzu sees time as an ally. Almost anything can be overcome if you wait for the right moment. Clausewitz sees time as opportunity. You have to act before you lose the advantage. One advises patience and fluidity, the other, focus and decisive action. Yet they share something crucial. Both reject war as a mindless adventure. For both, war has to be calculated, thought through, and conducted responsibly. Neither one glorifies conflict for its own sake. Both understand that war brings suffering, risk, and consequences that can't be fully measured. The difference is in how to deal with that reality. Sun Tzu believes the best war is the one that never takes place. Clausewitz believes that if war does break out, it should be fought with clear purpose, all the way through. One strategy looks like a quiet chess match. The other looks like a machine in motion. Today, in a world full of hybrid conflicts, where war isn't just physical, but also informational, cyber, and psychological, Sun Tzu's wisdom feels more current than ever. Winning without fighting, controlling narratives, shaping perceptions, and demobilizing your opponent without firing a shot. That's pure Sun Tzu. At the same time, in open conflicts between states where force is still used on a large scale, Clausewitz's thinking is still essential. Both thinkers went far beyond the battlefield. Their ideas influence leadership, management, diplomacy, geopolitics, even marketing. Wherever there's a clash of interests and a need for strategy, their voices show up. Sun Tzu with subtlety, Clausewitz with rigor. In the end, this philosophical clash between Taoist strategy and Western strategy is also a mirror of the cultures that produced them. Sun Tzu reflects the Chinese view of the world as balance, circularity, and dynamic harmony. Clausewitz reflects the European modern view of the world as something to be controlled, measured, and directed in a straight line. And we, caught between these two views, are still asking, what is the real path to victory? To dominate, or to adapt, to impose your will, or dissolve the conflict before it explodes? The art of war is still, at its core, the art of choosing. On opposite sides of the ancient world, two thinkers laid the foundations for radically different ways of thinking. On one side, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who systematized Western logic, science and metaphysics, argued that thought must follow firm, clear, mutually exclusive principles, like the famous principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot both be and not be at the same time. On the other side, Nagarjuna, an Indian Buddhist master from the 2nd century, proposed a subtle and unsettling kind of logic, where no statement can be sustained in an absolute way. For him, every essence is an illusion. Every concept is an empty construction. The difference between the two isn't just technical, it's ontological, existential, spiritual. Aristotle wanted to find the order of being. Nagarjuna wanted to free us from the illusion of fixed being. Aristotle saw knowledge as discovering causes, categories, and definitions. Nagarjuna saw knowledge as a path to emptying out mental fixations. The first builds an architecture of reality. The second dismantles every appearance of solidity. At the heart of Aristotelian thought is classical logic, based on three fundamental principles: identity, A is A; non-contradiction, A is not non-A; and the excluded middle, either A or not A, with no middle option. These rules allowed Greek philosophy, and later modern science, to organize the world into categories, state truths, and build systems of knowledge on top of stable propositions. Aristotle wanted, above all, thinking that was ordered and reliable. To get there, he developed syllogisms, logical inference, classifications of beings, and distinctions like substance versus accident, essence versus appearance. His thinking starts from the idea that things have an essence, a fixed nature that reason can know. A human being, for example, is essentially a rational animal. Essence comes before what is accidental, and true knowledge is what grasps that essence. Nagarjuna, on the other hand, begins his work, especially in the Mula Madhyama Kakarika, fundamental verses of the Middle Way, with a radically different proposal. There is no essence. Everything that exists does so in a dependent, relational way, empty of any self-contained identity. This is what he calls shunyata, or emptiness. Nothing exists in itself. Everything exists only in relation to everything else. A cup exists because of form, function, material, the mind that recognizes it. But if you try to isolate it as a thing in itself, it falls apart. For Nagarjuna, concepts are useful, but never final. They're like a map, never the territory. The mind's mistake is clinging to concepts as if they were ultimate reality. When we say something is, we're already creating an illusion. When we say it is not, we fall into another illusion. For him, it's not enough to negate. You also have to negate the negation. Nagarjuna breaks down opposites using his famous tetralemma, 4 possibilities that expose the collapse of absolute categories. Something is not. Both is and is not. Neither is, nor is not. This structure isn't just a mental game. It's used to dissolve our attachment to fixed being and to free the mind from conceptual prisons. Where Aristotle wants to build solid truths, Nagarjuna wants to open space. Where Greek thought builds itself by affirming being, Nagarjuna's Buddhist thought moves by undoing our attachment to being. Both are answering a deep question. How do we know what's real? But they start from different experiences. Aristotle looks at the world with the eyes of a scientist and system builder. For him, to understand something is to name it, classify it, and define its formal cause and purpose. Nagarjuna, immersed in the Buddhist tradition, sees suffering as rooted in attachment to identity, to I, me, mine. To know what's real, then, is to see the non-substantial nature of things, to realize that everything is impermanent, interdependent, and empty of essence. There's a strong emotional charge in this contrast. Aristotelian logic gives us ontological security. A world that can be divided into clear categories is a world we can understand. Nagarjuna, however, points to an abyss. If everything is empty, how do we live? The paradox is that for him, it's exactly when we stop obsessing over a solid ground that true freedom appears. Emptiness is not non-existence. It's radical openness to the full range of reality. In ethics, the difference is also decisive. Aristotle builds his ethics of virtue on human essence. Humans are rational beings, so the good life is one guided by reason, balance, and moderation. Nagarjuna, within the Buddhist path, sees ethics as a natural result of loosening our attachment to the ego. When you realize that the self is a temporary construction, compassion, non-violence, and openness to others arise naturally. Aristotle's binary logic serves clarity and the building of systematic knowledge. Without it, we wouldn't have science as we know it. But it depends on believing in a stable, structured world where objects and concepts match up. Nagarjuna, meanwhile, warns that every concept is a way of freezing a reality that's always flowing. His method is closer to meditation than to formal analysis. Deconstruct, let go, and see what's left when all concepts dissolve. This also has deep implications for language. Aristotle believed that language, while imperfect, can reflect the structure of the world. Nagarjuna saw language as dangerous. As soon as it names, it separates. And by separating, it creates illusion. The path of wisdom is to see that language is like a finger pointing at the moon, useful, but not to be confused with the moon itself. In the history of thought, these two approaches became the foundations of two very different traditions. The West built its philosophy, science, law, and politics on an Aristotelian base. Identity, clarity, and reason as our main guide. The East, especially Mahayana Buddhism, developed a contemplative, paradoxical approach where wisdom means seeing through appearances, not nailing down final truths. But in the modern world, the tension between these views has taken on new meaning. Modern science, especially quantum physics and relativity, started showing that reality isn't as solid as it once seemed. Concepts like particle, time, space, and causality became more fluid and interdependent. Nagarjuna's logic, once dismissed as mystical or illogical, now looks to many like a deep insight into the non-fixed, changing, relational nature of things. And in today's philosophy, especially in philosophy of language, phenomenology, and deconstruction, there's a growing critique of binary logic, of the metaphysics of presence, of fixing meaning once and for all. Thinkers like Derrida, Heidegger, and even Foucault, in their different critiques of Western metaphysics, end up echoing Nagarjuna's core intuition. The categories we use to think the world are constructions that reveal, but also hide, reality. Maybe the biggest contrast between Nagarjuna and Aristotle isn't in their conclusions, but in their intentions. Aristotle wants thought to master the world. Nagarjuna wants thought to free itself from the world it built. One trusts reason to order being. The other sees reason as a stepping stone that must be left behind once it's done its job. In the end, both are chasing truth. But while Aristotle sees truth as something we reach through definition, Nagarjuna sees it as something we reach by letting go of certainty. One builds bridges between ideas. The other dissolves the bridges and points to the river. In the 19th century, Søren Kierkegaard walked the streets of Copenhagen, tormented by how religion had turned into an empty habit. In the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre, in the middle of the devastation of World War II, declared that God was dead, and that now human beings were on their own, radically free. They lived in different times and worlds, but they faced the same central question: what does it mean to exist? From deeply personal human experiences, Kierkegaard and Sartre laid the foundations of existentialist thought. But while Kierkegaard said, existence demands a leap of faith in the face of the paradox between the finite and the infinite, Sartre said, life must be lived with no higher authority at all, accepting the full weight of freedom. Out of this comes one of the most powerful tensions in modern thought: Christian existentialism versus atheist existentialism. Kierkegaard, born in 1813, saw modernity as sick. Hegel's philosophy, which dominated European thought, tried to organize reality into a logical, almost divine system where everything made sense. But for Kierkegaard, that was an illusion. No system could explain the anxiety of a human being when they face themselves. No rational theory could justify suffering, faith, or love. Existence is not an abstract concept. It's concrete, lived, marked by deep contradictions and personal, non-transferable decisions. That's why Kierkegaard made the individual his central category. Truth isn't found in universal formulas, but in a subjective relationship with the absolute. Faith, for him, is not rational certainty. It's a leap, a risky move. He uses the example of Abraham, who, called by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, had to act against logic, against common ethics, against anything that could be rationally justified. That silent, absurd moment of decision before God is for Kierkegaard the model of true faith. He called this the leap of faith, an existential move in which the individual leaves behind every rational guarantee and throws themselves in anxiety and passion into trusting God. Existence, in this sense, is tragic, yes, but it's not empty, because underneath it all there is an ultimate meaning, even if it's paradoxical, that can only be reached through faith. Sartre, on the other hand, starts from the same existential problem, but ends up somewhere else. Born in 1905, he witnessed the ruins of the First and Second World Wars, the collapse of ideologies, disappointment with religion, and a crisis of reason itself. For him, human existence has no metaphysical foundation. God, if he ever existed, is absent from the world. And that absence is not just a fact, it's a kind of liberation. Sartre's key phrase sums it up. Existence precedes essence. That means the human being has no pre-given nature. There is no divine plan, no fixed human essence, no soul with a ready-made destiny. First we exist. We're thrown into the world without reason and without explanation. And only afterward do we become whatever we choose to be. But this radical freedom isn't easy. It comes with anxiety, responsibility, and loneliness. There are no excuses and no ready-made scripts. Each one of us is the author of our own existence. We're not victims of the system or servants of God. We're condemned to be free, as Sartre puts it. And that condemnation lies in the fact that we can't escape the freedom to choose. For Kierkegaard, anxiety was the sign that the leap of faith was near. For Sartre, anxiety is the weight of freedom. There's no absolution. The human being is alone in the universe, and it's on us to create values, give life meaning, and act authentically. Bad faith, a central concept in his work, happens when a person tries to run away from that freedom. Hiding behind social roles, traditions, religion, or any excuse that lets them dodge responsibility. The contrast is clear. For Kierkegaard, running away from faith is running away from meaning. For Sartre, using faith as a crutch is giving up freedom. One sees God as the fullness of existence. The other sees God's absence as our only chance to be truly free. And yet, both treat existence with the same seriousness. Neither one makes life cheap or shallow. Both reject easy answers, both attack conformity, and both face anxiety head-on. Existentialism, whether Christian or atheist, is always a philosophy of confrontation, of looking straight into the void, the absurd, and the pain of being alive. Kierkegaard would say, existence without God is despair, a deep abandonment that people try to hide behind aesthetics, ethics, or system. For him, a person only truly becomes themselves when they relate to the eternal, to the living God who cannot be grasped by reason, but is encountered through faith. Sartre, in contrast, would say this despair is actually the original human condition, and that the real challenge is to accept this lack of guarantees with maturity and creativity. Human beings, for him, shouldn't look for a savior, but become the authors of themselves. In Sartre's works, like Being and Nothingness or Nausea, existence shows up as a weight pressing down on us. Everything is contingent. Everything could just as easily not exist. Freedom, even though it defines us, is also what crushes us. There's no essence to discover, only the ongoing work of creating meaning in an indifferent way. In Kierkegaard's books, especially Fear and Trembling and The Sickness Unto Death, existence is lived as a tension between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. The human being is a walking paradox, and only in faith do they find rest. But that faith is torment. Believing is not easy, and anyone who truly believes knows this. Real faith happens in the dark, where there's no proof, no logic, only passionate trust. Despite their differences, both men shaped the 20th century. Sartre's existentialism inspired political, intellectual, and artistic movements. Kierkegaard influenced theologians like Paul Tillich and philosophers like Karl Jaspers, Gabriel Marcel, and even Heidegger, who, in his own way, drew from both of them. The tension between Kierkegaard and Sartre is still alive in each of us whenever we ask, what is the meaning of my life? Some people find an answer in faith, and there we hear Kierkegaard. Others accept the silence of the universe and the absolute freedom of existing, and there we hear Sartre. Many of us swing between the two, as if existence really were this field of opposing forces, between the call of a God who seems absent and the scream of a self that isn't enough on its own. In the end, Kierkegaard invites us to jump, even if it hurts, even if we can't see the ground. Sartre challenges us to walk, even if it's alone, even if there's no promised destination. In 5th century BC Athens, a silent revolution was taking shape. Democracy was flourishing, the arts were shining, and philosophy was taking its first real steps. But along with this progress came conflict, not with weapons, but with ideas. At the center of this tension was a strange man who walked the streets of Athens barefoot, asking uncomfortable questions. Socrates, and opposing him weren't just politicians or ignorant people, but a highly influential class of thinkers known as the Sophists, masters of rhetoric, argument, and persuasion. This clash between Socrates and the Sophists wasn't just a fight over method. It was a quiet war between two views of knowledge, truth, and human life itself. Socrates believed there was such a thing as truth, and that it could and should be pursued. The Sophists saw truth as something relative, flexible, useful. For Socrates, philosophy was a path of inner transformation. For the Sophists, it was a tool of power. The Sophists appeared in a time of intense intellectual energy. As Athenian democracy grew, the ability to speak well and persuade others became essential. Citizens needed to debate in assemblies, defend their ideas in courts, and influence political decisions. Rhetoric became a weapon, and the Sophists were its top instructors. They were paid to teach young men how to argue, how to win verbal disputes, how to sound wise even if they weren't. Thinkers like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias didn't completely deny the existence of truth, but they claimed it wasn't absolute. It changed with context, culture, and each individual. Protagoras' famous phrase sums it up: "Man is the measure of all things." In other words, what's true for one person might not be true for another. There is no universal, fixed standard for what is just, beautiful, good, or true. Everything depends on your point of view. This relativistic stance can sound modern, even liberating, but to Socrates, it was dangerous. He saw in it the risk of manipulation, superficiality, and the corruption of the soul. Empty rhetoric, with no commitment to reality, turned speech into pure performance. For him, knowledge wasn't something you packaged and sold. It was something you searched for, with humility, through dialogue and critical reflection. That's why Socrates refused to be called a teacher. He didn't charge for what he did. He didn't offer ready-made answers. On the contrary, he asked questions, a lot of them. He annoyed people. He interrupted. He tore apart other people's certainties. His method, mautics, was about helping the other person give birth to their own ideas, like a midwife assisting at a birth. But unlike the Sophists, his goal wasn't to win a debate. It was to spark genuine thinking, to expose the inner contradictions of the person he was talking to and open a path to something deeper: love of truth. This search for truth put him on a collision course with many people. Young men followed him, fascinated. Powerful people got irritated. The Sophists, who sold wisdom like a commodity, saw him as a threat. And the city, used to appearances, started to distrust this man who kept saying he knew nothing, but who, one by one, exposed those who only pretended to know. The tension between Socrates and the Sophists reached its peak in his trial and death sentence, under the charges of corrupting the youth and not honoring the city's god. In his defense, recorded by Plato in the Apology, Socrates reaffirms his commitment to truth and conscience. The unexamined life is not worth living. He could have escaped. He could have stayed quiet. But he chose to die faithful to his philosophical mission, because for him, betraying the truth was worse than losing his life. This radical stance shows the ethical difference between him and the Sophists. While they taught how to seem truthful, Socrates cared about what is true. While the Sophists used words as instruments of power, Socrates used them as instruments of freedom. For the Sophists, speech was an art. For Socrates, it was a moral responsibility. Still, it's important to admit that the Sophists weren't just con artists. They made real contributions. They encouraged critical thinking, questioned traditions, and challenged dogmas. In a way, they were the first cultural relativists, recognizing that values are not universal, but historical. However, by cutting the link between speech and truth, they opened the door to cynicism. For Socrates, that was unacceptable. The clash between Socrates and the Sophists is more than just a chapter in philosophy books. It's a living tension between two ways of using language. One that cares about persuasion above all else, and another that cares about truth, even when it's uncomfortable. One that bends to whatever is convenient in the moment, another that commits to something eternal, even in uncertain times. This tension is still with us today. When leaders, politicians, or influencers say what people want to hear, even knowing it's not true, they're acting like sophists. When someone dares to ask hard questions, cut through appearances, and point out contradictions, they're acting like Socrates. When education turns into training people just to succeed, it loses its Socratic soul. When it forms critical citizens committed to truth, it honors his legacy. Socrates believed truth wasn't something you own, but an ethical goal. Nobody has it completely, but everyone should seek it. That search demands courage, humility, and love of wisdom. Truth for him isn't relative because it's rooted in the soul itself. There is such a thing as the good, the just, the true, even if they're hard to reach. And that ideal should guide the philosopher's life. The sophists, on the other hand, remind us that truth can be used as a tool of domination, that every speech carries interests, that values do change. They warn us against dogmatism, against the arrogance of speaking in the name of absolute truth without being aware of our own limits. But when they deny any objective truth at all, they also weaken the ground where justice and real dialogue are built. Between Socrates' ethical rigor and the sophists' argumentative skill, the modern world keeps swinging back and forth. There are moments when we crave authenticity, others when we prefer appearances, times when we want real questions, times when we settle for comfortable answers. The choice between one side and the other isn't just intellectual, it's moral, political, and spiritual. The biggest danger is confusing the two, mistaking the sophist for the wise person and the philosopher for the arrogant one. History is full of charismatic figures who mastered language, but weren't seeking truth, only power. Socrates warns us about that. His life is a reminder that philosophy is not just a technique, it's a calling. It's not meant to please, it's meant to transform. And so, the clash between Socrates and the sophists is still alive inside each of us. Every time we choose between winning an argument or seeking the truth, every time we stay silent just to keep the peace or speak up to make people think, every time we resist manipulation, even when it's wrapped in beautiful words, the true disciple of Socrates isn't the one who repeats his ideas, it's the one who has the courage to live his question. In ancient China, during the turbulent Warring States period, 475–221 BC, one central question obsessed the thinkers of the time. How do you restore order in a society plunged into chaos? On one side were those who believed human nature is messy, selfish, and dangerous, and that order could only come from strict laws and harsh punishments. On the other side were those who saw in human beings a potential for virtue that could be nurtured, and who argued that real order is born from moral example and ethical education. These two paths took shape in two major philosophical schools: legalism, associated with thinkers like Han Feizi, and Confucianism, founded by Confucius and carried on by his disciples like Mencius. The clash between these two views shaped not only imperial China, but also left a lasting philosophical tension that's still relevant: rule with an iron fist or lead with the heart. Han Feizi, the main theorist of legalism, looked at reality through deeply skeptical eyes. For him, people are not naturally good. They are driven by self-interest. They are greedy, selfish, and likely to disobey whenever they can. Starting from this premise, he argued that the only way to control society is through clear, tough, and non-negotiable laws. Justice, for Han Feizi, shouldn't depend on intentions or character, but on objective actions and proportional punishment. In legalism, there is no room for moral appeals or ethical preaching. A wise ruler is not the one who inspires, but the one who builds an impersonal system where fear of punishment keeps people in line. Virtue, in this system, is irrelevant. What matters is effectiveness. A strong system is one where rules aren't flexible and punishment is inevitable. Fear, far from being a flaw, is considered a legitimate tool of stability. Han Feizi was blunt. A leader who trusts people's morality will be betrayed by them. A king who tries to rule by example will be outplayed by manipulative courtiers. The ruler should be distant, calculating, and impersonal, like the law he represents. The state should work like a well-tuned machine, where behavior is shaped by rewards and punishments, not by appeals to conscience. Confucius, who lived 2 centuries earlier, looked at the same reality with a more hopeful gaze. For him, China's crisis wouldn't be solved with punishment, but with moral education, respect for tradition, and the cultivation of virtue. His philosophy starts from the assumption that human beings have within themselves the capacity to become good, just, and compassionate, as long as they are guided by good examples. At the heart of Confucian ethics is the concept of Ren, humanity, benevolence, compassion. Confucius believed that real social order begins inside each person's heart. A just ruler inspires loyal ministers, who in turn inspire virtuous citizens. Hierarchy in this framework is not oppression, but responsibility. The father should be a good father, the son, a good son, the ruler, a moral role model. People imitate what they see at the top. Alongside Ren, another key concept is Li, the set of rituals, traditions, and proper behaviors that shape social life. These rituals aren't just religious ceremonies. They are ways of internalizing respect, harmony, and self-control. Li doesn't force from the outside. It transforms the soul through habit, repetition, and reverence. Where legalism sees law as punishment, Confucianism sees ritual as education. The crucial difference lies in their view of human nature. Legalism starts with distrust. Confucianism starts with trust. For Han Feizi, a human being is like a wild horse that can only be controlled with tight reins. For Confucius, a human being is like a seed of virtue that needs the right care to bloom. One philosophy bets on fear, the other bets on education. The practical application of these ideas was just as different. When the Qin dynasty unified China in 221 BC, the first emperor Qin Shi Huang adopted legalism as the official doctrine. He burned Confucian books, persecuted scholars, centralized power, and created an extremely harsh legal system. The result was an efficient unification, but also an empire that was feared, hated, and overthrown within a few decades. The Han dynasty, which followed the Qin, learned from that experience. It abandoned legalism as the main philosophy and adopted Confucianism as the foundation of government. Civil servants began to be selected through exams based on Confucian classics. A ruler's morality came to be seen as essential for political legitimacy. Harmony, not fear, became the political ideal. But it would be unfair to paint legalism only as tyranny and Confucianism only as wisdom. Legalism brought an important insight. Institutions need to be strong and impersonal. Power needs clear rules. And personal morality alone is not enough to guarantee justice. In many situations, relying only on virtue is naive. The rule of law matters. A good government probably needs a balance of both, personal ethics and solid institutions. Confucianism, with its ethical idealism, carries its own risks. It can overlook human weakness. In a world where many leaders are not virtuous, relying only on example can be dangerous. That's why some modern thinkers argue that a mature political system should blend the best of both sides. Confucian morality with legalist realism about institutions. In practice, this tension between order through fear and order through virtue is still present in modern societies. When governments adopt heavy surveillance, harsh punishment, and tight control, they echo Han Feizi. When they invest in civic education, in moral example from leaders, and in a culture of respect, they follow Confucius's path. Anytime we debate whether it's better to have an efficient but authoritarian leader, or a virtuous but flawed one? We're revisiting this old Chinese dilemma. On a deeper level, this clash forces us to ask, what works better in the long run? Fear or inspiration? Punishment or education? Control or trust? Every answer carries a political philosophy, a view of human nature, and a bet on what kind of society we want to build. And maybe in times of crisis, the instinct is to fall back on legalism, to seek order at any cost. But Confucius would remind us that order enforced by fear is fragile. It may work for a while, but it doesn't change the heart. And without inner change, peace is just a facade. On the other hand, believing blindly that everyone will act virtuously is naive. There are times when tough rules are necessary, when morality fails. The challenge for any mature society is to balance justice with humanity, discipline with empathy, law with example. Few philosophers have caused as much discomfort, disruption, and fascination as Friedrich Nietzsche. In a Europe still marked by the Christian tradition, by a morality shaped by faith and the ideal of sacrifice, Nietzsche rose as a rebellious, fierce, and lonely voice. His main target, Christianity, not just as a religion, but as the moral foundation of the entire Western culture. For Nietzsche, Christianity was not a doctrine of love and salvation. It was a morality of the weak, the resentful, the people who couldn't stand strength, beauty, and the full affirmation of life. His critique cuts through centuries of religious tradition to expose what he called an inversion of values, a historical process in which what used to be considered noble, proud, and powerful became labeled as sin, arrogance, and pride. And what used to be seen as weak, submissive, and passive was elevated to the status of virtue. This critique shows up clearly in works like On the Genealogy of Morality, Beyond Good and Evil, and The Antichrist. Nietzsche argues that Christian morality didn't grow out of strength, but out of weakness. The resentment of those who couldn't dominate, conquer, or assert their will turned into a morality that denies life, and calls that denial holiness. In this move, the strong were condemned as sinners, and the submissive were glorified as pure of heart. Nietzsche called this a slave morality. Unlike the morality of masters, which celebrates courage, vitality, nobility, pleasure, and creativity, Christian morality teaches forgiveness, humility, repentance, and obedience. For Nietzsche, these values didn't emerge as natural virtues, but as a defensive reaction from a powerless group that couldn't assert itself in the world. So it created a moral code that punished exactly those who could. What's at stake here isn't just Christianity as spiritual faith, but the way its values sank deep into Western culture, shaping politics, ethics, art, and psychology. Nietzsche saw this as a poisoning of life. Everything spontaneous, instinctive, creative, and powerful became suspicious. The body became the enemy of the soul. Pleasure became the enemy of purity. Pride became the enemy of humility. The world became the enemy of God. In response to this tradition, Nietzsche calls for a revaluation of all values. In other words, it's time to flip the flip. Breaking with Christian morality isn't for him just some teenage rebellion. It's a deep philosophical act that gives life its primary value back. Nietzsche didn't just want to destroy. He wanted to create a new kind of human being, the Overman, Übermensch, someone who lives beyond herd morality, creates their own values, and affirms existence with courage and intensity. At the center of this new vision is the concept of the will to power, not just as a desire to dominate others, but as a creative life force, a basic drive to expand, affirm, and surpass oneself. Christianity, with its doctrine of original sin, redemption through suffering, and salvation through the denial of instinct, represents, for Nietzsche, a denial of that will. He calls Christ the last idealist, someone who chose to die to save a world that denies itself. But he saves his harshest words for Paul, whom he accuses of turning Jesus' death into a theology of submission and resentment. Where Christianity says, be humble, Nietzsche says, be strong. Where Christianity says, love your enemies, Nietzsche asks, why deny your natural impulses in the name of an artificial morality? Where Christianity promises a future paradise in exchange for present renunciation, Nietzsche demands, affirm the now, embrace the earth, the body, the will. And yet, his critique is not simple nihilism. Nietzsche doesn't argue for the destruction of all values. He argues for the creation of new values that come from life and serve life, not from the denial of life. He knows that the death of God, announced in the gay science, leaves a void, an anxiety, an abyss. But he also sees in that death a chance for a new dawn. Modern humanity, freed from divine guardianship, now has to take responsibility for itself. The tension between Nietzsche and Christianity goes far beyond institutional religion. It hits the core of what it means to be human. Human beings are creatures of instinct and reason, strength and compassion, pride and vulnerability. Christianity bet on controlling impulses and elevating the spirit. Nietzsche bets on integrating instincts and cleansing consciousness through the intensity of existence. His proposal is deeply existential. Live as if every moment of your life were going to repeat eternally. The idea of the eternal return. That's the ultimate test. Are you living a life you'd be willing to live again, forever, exactly as it is? If the answer is no, then you're probably living under borrowed values, under ideals that deny your inner truth. Nietzsche wants each person to be faithful to themselves, to the point of becoming the artist of their own existence. Nietzsche's critique of Christianity is not only destructive, it's meant to be freeing. He wants to free human beings from the weight of guilt, from the rejection of the body, from the fear of eternal judgment. He wants to give life back its power and lightness. But that kind of freedom demands courage. There are no more promises of salvation, no more authority telling you what's right or wrong. There's only you, your will, your creation. And even those who remain in the Christian faith can't walk away untouched by his critique. He forces religion to look in the mirror and ask, am I promoting life or fear, growth or submission? Am I forming free human beings or tamed ones? Nietzsche's strength is in pushing us into this inner confrontation, where there's no room for hypocrisy. In the end, Nietzsche doesn't want followers. He wants creators. He doesn't want more masters to obey. He wants individuals willing to face the cosmic loneliness of existence with radical honesty. Against the morality of the weak, he offers inner strength. Against fear, affirmation. Against guilt, freedom. The clash between Nietzsche and Christianity isn't just theological. It's a battle over what you do with your own life. Do you hide in the comfort of inherited values, or dare to create new paths? Do you renounce this world in the name of future promises, or affirm this world with everything tragic, beautiful, and real that it contains? Nietzsche pushes us to live with more intensity, more authenticity, and less fear. If Christianity, at its highest level, also claims to offer liberation, then maybe the real challenge isn't simply picking a side, but understanding that life itself is this field of tension between strength and love, autonomy and surrender, between the cross and the hammer. When René Descartes, in the 17th century, isolated himself to doubt everything, he wasn't just retreating to think, he was starting one of the biggest movements in Western philosophy, the search for an indestructible foundation for knowledge, a starting point that could withstand doubt, uncertainty, and the mistakes of the senses. The answer he found was radical. Reason, and only reason, can give us certainty. That's how modern rationalism was born. On the other side, a century later, David Hume looked at that same ambition and took it apart piece by piece. For him, any absolute certainty is just a comfortable illusion. Reason doesn't create knowledge. It only organizes what our senses give us. The world isn't made of clear and distinct ideas, but of impressions, habits, and experiences. Hume pushed British empiricism to its limit, and in doing so, shook the foundations of modern rationality itself. The clash between Descartes and Hume is more than an abstract debate about knowledge. It's a deep disagreement about how we know the world, what we can truly know, and how far we can trust the human mind. On one side, reason as the supreme guide. On the other, experience as the only solid ground. René Descartes, born in 1596, was deeply affected by the instability of knowledge in his time. The collapse of scholasticism, religious conflicts, and the rise of modern science all worked against traditional confidence in what people thought they knew. Faced with this chaos, Descartes decided to start from scratch. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, he proposes the method of radical doubt. Question everything that can possibly be doubted, including the senses, the body, the external world, and even mathematics. But there is one thing you can't doubt: the very act of doubting. From there comes his most famous phrase, cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This thought, according to him, is absolutely certain, because even if I'm mistaken, I'm still a thinking being. Starting from this first certainty, Descartes tries to rebuild the entire structure of knowledge. God, the world, matter, everything has to be proven based on pure reason. His project is mathematical, almost geometric. Reason is clear, distinct, and organizing. The senses, on the other hand, are deceptive. He uses examples like a stick that looks bent in water or dreams that feel completely real. Nothing that comes from experience can be trusted without being filtered by reason. For Descartes, true knowledge is a priori, prior to experience, and should have the same kind of clarity as a mathematical theorem. David Hume, born in 1711, represents the opposite reaction. With a sharp, skeptical mind, he looked at those rationalist ambitions with suspicion. In his inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume argues that all knowledge comes from experience, and that the mind is not an active source of ideas, but a storage of sensory impressions. Everything we think comes from impressions, vivid sensations, or from ideas, which are just faint copies of those impressions. For Hume, ideas like substance, soul, God, or cause, all central to rationalist philosophy, are really just products of habit, imagination, or culture. They have no solid basis in experience. Take the idea of causality. We believe that fire causes heat because we've always seen that pattern repeat. But that cause and effect link is not something we actually see with our senses. It's an expectation created by repetition, not a rationally provable connection. With this, Hume directly attacks the rationalist claim that we can reach absolute certainty. Science, in his view, is not built on necessary truths, but on probability and expectation. We don't know the sun will rise tomorrow because of some logical deduction. We just expect it because it always has. Reason, says Hume, is the slave of the passions. It's not intellect that truly guides humans, but habit, experience, and psychological tendencies. The difference in method between the two is clear. Descartes starts with the intellect, looking for self-evident truths. Hume starts with the senses, watching how the mind actually works. One bets on the clarity of deduction, the other on the modesty of observation. But there's something deeper at stake: trust in reason as a path to truth. Descartes believes that, if we follow the right method, we can reach irrefutable conclusions, even about God, the soul, and the external world. Hume, on the contrary, thinks that trust is an illusion. He shows that we can't even justify, in a rational way, the basic principle of induction, the idea that the future will be like the past. Here, Hume goes beyond Locke or Berkeley. He shows that science itself rests on assumptions that can't be proven by reason. We act as if the world were stable, as if natural laws never change. But that confidence is not logical, it's psychological. And that opens the door to a kind of crisis for reason itself. Descartes wanted to defeat skepticism with an infallible method. Hume pushed skepticism to its limit and showed that no method is infallible. Even so, he doesn't fall into total nihilism. What he proposes is a more honest philosophy, more aware of the limits of the human mind, and closer to lived experience. The tension between them reflects two very different views of what a human being is. Descartes sees us as thinking beings, equipped with pure reason, capable of knowing eternal truths. Hume sees us as sensitive, limited beings, shaped by experiences and inclinations. The first almost turns humans into rational angels. The second brings us back down to earth, with our uncertainties and impulses. In the end, the dispute between rationalism and empiricism is a dispute about where knowledge really begins. Can we know anything without the senses? Can we trust only experience? Is anything truly secure beyond math and logic? Descartes answers with the power of pure thought. Hume answers with the weight of the real world. Ironically, the philosopher who tried to reconcile the two was Immanuel Kant, who said reading Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. Kant argued that knowledge depends both on experience and on a priori structures of the mind, like space, time, and causality. That way, he tries to build a bridge between the worlds of Descartes and Hume. But that's another story. What Descartes and Hume leave us is more than a clash of methods. They offer two paths of thinking, one more confident, the other more cautious. One calls us to universal reason, the other to empirical humility. And between them, we're still trying to figure out where knowledge really begins and where our certainties end. In 1859, a book permanently changed the way humans understand themselves and their place in the universe. Published by Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species, introduced the theory of evolution by natural selection, an idea as powerful as it was unsettling. For the first time, a fully natural, non-theological explanation for the diversity of life had solid scientific backing. The impact was immediate. It called into question not only the origin of species, but also the philosophical, moral, and spiritual foundations of human existence. At the heart of the debate is a deep question. Is life the result of blind natural processes, or of an intelligent mind that designed it? On one side, Darwinian biology claims that the complexity of living beings is the product of random genetic variations, filtered by natural selection over huge stretches of time. On the other side, defenders of intelligent design argue that certain biological structures are so complex and so precisely tuned to their functions that they couldn't possibly have arisen by chance or blind selection. They must be the result of a higher intention. This clash goes far beyond biology. It's philosophical, theological, and existential, because behind the dispute between Darwin and the proponents of intelligent design is the oldest question of all. Is there purpose in life, or are we just a cosmic accident? At its core, Darwin's theory breaks with any idea of a fixed essence or deliberate blueprint. According to Darwin, species weren't created as they are now. They descend from common ancestors and gradually changed over time. Natural selection acts like a filter. Random genetic variations pop up, and the ones that give an advantage in survival and reproduction are more likely to be passed on. There's no need for a creator stepping in. The process is impersonal, blind, and continuous. This idea deeply shook the Christian worldview, especially the one based on a literal reading of the Bible. The creation story in Genesis presents human beings as made in the image of God through an intentional act of love and purpose. Evolution, by contrast, seemed to reduce humans to a product of biological chance, with no soul, no plan, and no special place in the cosmos. That's the backdrop for the rise of the intelligent design movement. Unlike traditional creationism, which openly rejects evolution, intelligent design tries to take a more sophisticated approach. Its defenders, like Michael Bay and William Dembski, argue that certain biological structures are irreducibly complex, meaning they wouldn't work if even one part were missing, and therefore couldn't have evolved step by step. The favorite example is the bacterial flagellum, a kind of microscopic motor whose complexity, they say, points to a designer. Another argument they use is the fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe. Life as we know it depends on an extremely specific combination of cosmic variables, particle masses, gravitational strength, speed of light, and so on. For proponents of design, the odds of all this happening by chance are so tiny that the only reasonable explanation is deliberate planning. The conflict between Darwinism and intelligent design, however, isn't just about biological evidence, it's about explanatory models. The scientific method demands that hypotheses be testable, falsifiable, and empirical. Intelligent design, by appealing to an undetectable intelligence, slips out of the classic rules of science. That's why the scientific community in general sees it as pseudoscience or theology dressed up as biology. But defenders of design push back. They argue that science already accepts inferences to causes we don't directly observe, like with the Big Bang, dark matter, or archaeology, where we infer human intelligence from artifacts. If complexity can point to a mind in other fields, why not in biology? On the philosophical side, Darwinism raises tough questions about the nature of reality. If everything evolves through natural processes, where does meaning fit in? What about morality? If we're just more sophisticated animals shaped by evolutionary pressures, how do we justify universal ethical values? For some thinkers, like Nietzsche, the death of God, helped along by scientific progress, demands a radical reinvention of value. For others, like Richard Dawkins, the fact that evolution is blind doesn't make life less beautiful or meaningful. It simply means we're the ones who have to create meaning. The strength of Darwinism lies in its explanatory power and the massive body of evidence behind it. Fossils, comparative genetics, embryology, biogeography, all of it points to common ancestry. Evolution can be seen in real time, for example, in the development of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. DNA reveals unexpected links between species that seem very different on the surface. For modern science, there's no doubt that evolution is a fact, even if debates about the details of the mechanisms still exist. Yet intelligent design persists because it speaks to a deep human longing, the desire for life to have purpose, direction, and meaning. In an increasingly mechanistic world, the idea that there's a mind behind the cosmos offers existential comfort, moral order, and a sense of inherent dignity to human beings. Even if it's not science in the strict sense, design moves in the territory of philosophy and theology, where the questions are bigger than the available answers. Some people try to reconcile the two views. So-called theistic evolution argues that God might have created the world through evolution. In that model, natural selection is the tool of the divine, not its enemy. Many contemporary theologians accept evolution, but see it as expressing God's intention. This position avoids both biblical literalism and hardcore materialism, and proposes a kind of middle ground. God creates by way of nature, but even that attempt at synthesis faces criticism from both sides. More strict scientists say it's philosophically inconsistent. More rigid religious groups see it as a betrayal of faith. So the tension remains, a tension between two ways of seeing the world, one based on the impersonal order of nature, the other on the spiritual intention of a higher mind. Maybe the real issue isn't just which model is right, but what we're really looking for when we ask these questions. When we ask about the origin of life, we want more than data, we want meaning. Darwinism offers explanations, intelligent design offers purpose, and philosophy, as always, stands in the middle, trying to build bridges where there are walls, and inviting us to live with the mystery, the doubt, and the depth that these questions demand. In one of the most mysterious stories in the Chinese philosophical tradition, a man wakes up from a dream and asks himself, "Am I Zhuangzi who dreamed he was a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming I'm Zhuangzi?" This short parable, written in the 4th century BCE, holds inside it a radical break with the rational, ethical, and social tradition represented by Confucius. While Confucius tried to organize the world through virtue and ritual, Zhuangzi pointed to the uncertainty of every structure, every identity, every attempt to lock reality into something fixed. The contrast between the two is as deep as it is subtle. Both talked about harmony, the Tao, the way, and the relationship between the individual and the world. But where Confucius saw stability in tradition, in respect for hierarchy, and in exemplary behavior, Zhuangzi saw mental and social prisons that pull us away from the spontaneity of life. Confucius's world is guided by Li, rituals, Ren, human virtue, and social roles. Zhuangzi's world is marked by constant change, a fluid view of reality, and letting go of any fixed position. Confucius, born around 551 BCE, lived in a politically fragmented China marked by clan wars and the decline of the old Zhou values. His mission was clear: restore order through personal ethics and proper social practice. For him, society could only flourish if each person played their role with dignity and respect. The father as father, the son as son, the ruler as ruler. The key to this was moral education, reverence for tradition, and the repetition of rituals that connected humans to heaven and earth. Confucius did not reject heaven. On the contrary, he saw Tian, heaven, as a moral force that guides the universe. But this force shows up in the human world through cultivated virtue and the example of wise leaders and rulers. Justice, harmony, and mutual respect are the products of a society guided by stable values. Ethics, for Confucius, is something we live out together. Goodness isn't found in isolation, but in how we fulfill our duties in relationships. In this view, freedom is born from discipline. Zhuangzi, on the other hand, represents almost the opposite. Born about 2 centuries later, in an even more chaotic time, he sees attempts to fix the world as a tragic illusion. Rituals, rules, social identities, all of that for him are fragile constructions that pull us away from the true Tao, which can't be described, named, or captured. Zhuangzi doesn't want to fix the world. He wants to show that the very desire to fix it is already a mistake. The famous butterfly dream is more than just a poetic story. It calls into question the very distinction between subject and object, waking and dreaming, reality and illusion. If I can't know for sure who I am, how can I be sure what my role in the world is? And if forms are always changing, how can I cling to fixed rules? Zhuangzi even questions language itself. In his writings, full of humor, metaphors, fables, and reversals, he shows how words draw lines where there was only flow before. When we name something, we pull it out of the whole. When we classify, we create hierarchies. When we say, this is right, we automatically create wrong. But the Tao, the way, is beyond these opposites. It is movement, transformation, mystery. It can't be frozen into moral codes. That's where his criticism of Confucius cuts deepest. It's not about rejecting morality just to rebel, but about a philosophical point. Every attempt to trap the world in rules is partial, limited, and artificial. The true sage, for Zhuangzi, is not the one who follows rules, but the one who dances with chance, who adapts to the flow of things, who doesn't force a shape onto life, but lets himself dissolve into the shifting universe. While Confucianism values uprightness, clarity, and well-defined social roles, Zhuangzi proposes a kind of spiritual anarchy. For him, even the wise person who tries to teach wisdom can fall into his own trap. True wisdom is forgetting yourself, he says. True knowledge is not knowing. In this view, virtue isn't something you squeeze out with effort. It flows naturally when there's no inner resistance. The Taoist idea of wu wei, non-action or acting without forcing, is central here. For Zhuangzi, the world is already harmonious by nature. The problem begins when we try to control it, fix it, or put order on what can't be fully ordered. The more we try to impose our will, the further we move from the Tao. That's why he values the spontaneous, the useless, the unpredictable. The bamboo that bends in the wind survives the storm. The river that flows around the rock wears it down over time. The butterfly that flies with no agenda lives the Tao more wisely than the man who tries to dominate the truth. This philosophy has deep consequences. Instead of looking for a fixed place in society, the Zhuangzi-style sage seeks freedom from labels, obligations, and absolute truths. He doesn't want to change the world. He wants to let the world be. He doesn't want to convince others. He wants to live at peace with uncertainty. And unlike the moralist, who measures everything with an ethical ruler, Zhuangzi smiles at multiplicity. What's right for one person is wrong for another. What's beautiful today is ugly tomorrow. The tension between Zhuangzi and Confucius isn't just a historical disagreement. It's a clash between two ways of living. The first invites us to safety, clarity, and the nobility of responsible action. The second invites us to radical freedom, detachment, and the quiet laughter of the sage who watches everything pass. One tries to structure the world, the other dissolves the world back into its original fluidity. But there are points of contact too. Both value harmony, they just disagree about how to get there. For Confucius, harmony is built. For Zhuangzi, it appears when we stop interfering. Both want a more just world, but one believes in moral reform, and the other in freeing us from rigid morality. In times of crisis, each offers a path: ethical reconstruction or radical letting go. Maybe Zhuangzi's greatest lesson is in his refusal to cling even to his own ideas. He laughs at himself, undercuts his own arguments, and plays with paradox. Because he understands that every rigid position is a prison. Every ism is an illusion, and the true sage doesn't need to win the argument. He just needs to wake up from the dream of thinking he already knows. When Auguste Comte said that humanity would move from a theological and metaphysical stage to a scientific one, ruled by observation, experimentation, and objective laws, he believed he was pointing to the inevitable path of progress. Science, he argued, should be the model for all human knowledge. That's how positivism was born, a philosophy that saw measurement, method, and objectivity as the pillars of a new rational order. But later, other thinkers started to push back, not because they rejected science, but because they saw big limits in it when it comes to understanding human experience. For philosophers like Wilhelm Dilthey, Martin Heidegger, and especially Hans-Georg Gadamer, the lived world, the world of culture, history, language, and subjectivity, can't be reduced to formulas or statistics. That's where philosophical hermeneutics comes in, a way of thinking that values interpretation instead of measurement, dialogue instead of supposed neutrality. This tension between positivism and hermeneutics is one of the most important in modern philosophy. Because deep down it forces us to ask, can we really understand human beings with the same methods we use to study matter? Or do nature and human life require different ways of knowing? Comte thought the answer was yes, we can. For him, humanity evolves intellectually. In the first stage, the theological one, people explain everything through the gods. In the second, the metaphysical stage, they appeal to essences and abstract entities. But in the third stage, the positive stage, they drop hidden causes and start describing observable laws, like physics does. Comte wanted society, and even morality, to be rebuilt on scientific principles. Know in order to predict, predict in order to act, was his motto. That scientific optimism dominated the 19th century. The idea was clear. If we can apply the experimental method to the human sciences, we can solve social problems with the same precision we use to solve an equation. Objectivity was seen as the ultimate mark of truth. Real knowledge was what could be empirically verified, quantified, replicated. Anything outside that, values, intuitions, symbols, was labeled subjective and therefore unreliable. And that's exactly where philosophical hermeneutics breaks with positivism. Dilthey was the first to draw a key distinction between explaining, erklären, and understanding, verstehen. The natural sciences explain phenomena through causal laws. But in the human sciences, what matters is not causality, but lived meaning. Understanding a poem, an action, a religious belief, or a historical movement is not about explaining its causes. It's about interpreting its meaning. That interpretation, however, is not just a random guess. It is rooted in language, tradition, and history. Hans-Georg Gadamer, the main name in hermeneutics in the 20th century, says that all understanding is interpretation, and all interpretation is a kind of dialogue. The interpreter is never neutral. They bring their own horizon of meaning, their beliefs, their culture, their historical moment. When they meet a text, a work of art, or an event from the past, those horizons mix in what Gadamer calls a fusion of horizons. Unlike positivism, hermeneutics recognizes that there is no knowledge without presuppositions. Every investigation starts from somewhere, from a pre-understanding, a tradition, a language that shapes how we see things. So the goal is not to reach some impossible total objectivity, but to reach a deeper understanding that is more self-aware and more open to the other side. In practice, this means hermeneutics rejects the idea that truth can be reduced to data. For Gadamer, truth reveals itself in dialogue, in listening, in the tension between the old and the new. Aesthetic experience, for example, can't be explained in neurological or statistical terms alone. It demands an interpretive openness, an active participation of the person in what they're trying to understand. The same is true for history, religion, politics, and ethics. The difference in approach is radical. Positivism looks for prediction and control. Hermeneutics looks for meaning and understanding. One is based on repetition and quantitative analysis, the other on uniqueness and qualitative interpretation. And this isn't just a technical issue, it's about worldviews. Positivism believes reality is out there, ready to be described objectively. Hermeneutics sees reality as something always mediated by language, culture, and history. Here's a simple example. Imagine you have statistics about rising crime in a city. Positivism can measure the increase, connect it to socioeconomic factors, and make predictions using math models. Hermeneutics will ask, how do people actually experience this increase? How is it told in the media, felt on the streets, interpreted by different social groups? The data doesn't exhaust the meaning, because human reality is always lived, not just measured. Another example. In medicine, positivism brought huge advances: vaccines, antibiotics, surgeries. But when a patient walks into a doctor's office, their pain isn't only biological. It has a story, a meaning, a narrative. A doctor who really listens is doing hermeneutics. They interpret, they talk, they enter into the other person's world. And that kind of listening can heal as much as the medication. The hermeneutic critique of positivism is not a rejection of science. It's a critique of the imperialism of the scientific method, the idea that only what can be measured is real or important. Gadamer doesn't ask us to abandon science, but to recognize the limits of the scientific model when it comes to human life. After all, not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that can be measured really matters. This tension between objectivity and interpretation also shows up in education, politics, and justice. A legal system based only on abstract rules can end up being deeply unfair if it ignores context, intention, and the stories of the people involved. A school that only teaches formulas misses the fact that knowledge is also lived experience, personal discovery, and openness to others. In the end, the struggle between positivism and hermeneutics is a struggle over how we see the world and the human being. Are we biological machines reacting to stimuli? Or are we beings of language, memory, and meaning? Can we explain everything with general laws? Or is there always something unique, interpretive, and mysterious in human experience? The answer may not be to pick one side and throw away the other, but to recognize that different kinds of knowing have their place. The mistake of positivism was to forget about poetry, history, and the soul. The risk of hermeneutics is sliding into a total relativism, where everything is just interpretation, and nothing is solid at all. The challenge today is to balance rigor and listening, method and dialogue, precision and openness. Because understanding human beings takes more than formulas. It takes presence, attention, and a willingness to listen to what can't be turned into numbers. but in a very real way, defines who we are. Few philosophical clashes could be as radical and yet so mysteriously close as the one between Martin Heidegger, a 20th century German thinker, and Nagarjuna, a 2nd century Indian master. On one side, Heidegger is asking what it means to be, confronting what he saw as the age-old forgetting of this question in Western philosophy. On the other, Nagarjuna is tearing down all ontological notions, emptying out categories, dissolving essences. They walk in different directions, Heidegger toward being, Nagarjuna toward emptiness, shunyata. But both are reaching for the core of existence. For Heidegger, the tragedy of Western philosophy is that it forgot being. Ever since Plato, being got confused with beings, the things that exist, the objects in front of us. But being itself is not a thing. It's not an object. It's not something you look at or manipulate. Being is the condition that makes anything at all able to show up. It's the horizon in which things can appear and make sense. And that horizon, he says, has been covered over. In his main work, Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger wants to restart the question of being from the ground up. He's not interested in another metaphysics of substances or categories. He wants to understand the experience of being starting from the human being, which he calls Dasein, literally being there. Dasein isn't just a mind or a consciousness. It's a being that exists in the world, among things and with others, and is capable of asking about its own being. This openness to being shows up in concrete existence, but it's often buried under everyday routines, technical language, and purely calculating thinking. Heidegger sees Western tradition as a kind of fall, from a living sense of being into the rule of technique, objectification, and loss of meaning. Being turns into just another object. The world turns into a stockpile of resources, and humans become functionaries of efficiency. That's why, later in life, Heidegger turns to poetry, to the pre-Socratic Greeks, and to the silence of being. He feels that ordinary language is already trapped in fixed categories and can't really speak about being. Being, he says, is time, is unconcealment, aletheia, is that which shows itself and hides itself at the same time. It's not a given thing, it happens, like a flash of lighting. While Heidegger tries to reopen the question of being beyond traditional metaphysics, Nagarjuna goes even further. He denies that any ontological category has ultimate validity at all. As the founder of the Madhyamaka school of Mahayana Buddhism, Nagarjuna starts from the Buddhist teachings on impermanence and interdependence and pushes them to their extreme. Nothing has a fixed essence, not the self, not time, not even being. His most influential work, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Fundamental Verses of the Middle Way, is basically a philosophical demolition job. Nagarjuna doesn't build a new ontology, he dismantles every ontology. With relentless logic, he shows that any attempt to ground reality in some essence leads to contradictions. Reality, he says, is empty of its own independent nature, svabhava. That doesn't mean nothing exists. It means whatever exists, exists only in relation to other things. Everything is conditioned. Nothing is absolute. This is where his key idea comes in. Shunyata, emptiness. For Nagarjuna, to understand emptiness is to see reality as it really is, fluid, interdependent, and free from fixed clinging. And this isn't just a theory, it's a path to freedom from suffering. Suffering arises from attachment to fixed identities, absolute truths, and imaginary essences. While Heidegger attacks the forgetting of being, Nagarjuna attacks our attachment to being. For him, any attempt to capture reality in a concept is already a trap. The mind wants to fix, define, and separate. But reality is contingent, impermanent, relational. Even emptiness itself is empty of any fixed nature. Nagarjuna warns that it's not a new absolute, but a tool to break conceptual chains. Both thinkers, then, are wrestling with the limits of language and conceptual thought. Heidegger looks for a more originary, more poetic way of speaking that might let being appear. Nagarjuna shows that any language, simply by stating something, is already stepping away from what is. He works with what Buddhism calls the two truths: conventional truth, language, concepts, relative understanding, and ultimate truth, emptiness. But that ultimate truth can only be lived, never fully put into words. Heidegger talks about unconcealment, being as what reveals itself to Dasein. Nagarjuna talks about the end of illusion, the emptying out of mental constructions. For Heidegger, facing our own finiteness opens us to the truth of being. For Nagarjuna, dissolving the self opens the way to liberation. Both agree that clinging to fixed entities is a mistake, and that there is a deeper dimension of existence that only reveals itself when we stop forcing reality into rigid concepts. But there's a crucial difference. Heidegger still believes that being is something that shows itself, even if it's hidden most of the time. Being is the field where everything becomes present. It can be covered up, but it's not denied. Nagarjuna, on the other hand, insists that there is nothing there in the ultimate sense. Emptiness is not a hidden core. It's the radical absence of any fixed core. It's a complete emptying of any ontological substance. That doesn't lead to nihilism. Nagarjuna is clear. Denying essences isn't denying the world. It's freeing the world from the burden of having to be something solid and permanent. What appears instead is a reality that's lighter, more alive, more compassionate. When you really see that everything is empty, attachment, conflict, and violence, all born from the illusion of separation, start to fall away. Heidegger, in his own way, also sees a path of transformation. Listening to being can reconnect us with the meaning of existence. A Dasein that faces its own finiteness and opens itself to being can live in a more authentic way. Both, then, are pointing toward a transformative experience, whether through accepting the mystery of being or realizing the emptiness of being. One is a European thinker of the 20th century, the other, an Indian master from the 2nd century. One rooted in Greek and German traditions, the other in Mahayana Buddhism. And yet, they meet at one essential point. The deepest reality cannot be captured by fixed concepts. It demands openness, silence, listening, letting go, and maybe courage too. The courage to let our certainties fall apart. Heidegger says, being happens in time, in the event. Nagarjuna would say, time itself is empty, and the event has no fixed center. But both invite us to move beyond calculating thought, beyond instrumental logic, beyond dead forms of knowledge. Both ask us to look at reality with fresh eyes, eyes that aren't trying to grab and control, but are willing to be changed by what they see. For centuries, Western thought has been built on separation. The logic of either or, the split between body and soul, mind and matter, subject and object, good and evil. This way of thinking, deeply shaped by philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant, assumes that reality is made up of fixed entities that can be classified, compared, and isolated. This philosophical tradition, which we can call substantialist dualism, imagines the world in terms of essential oppositions. In traditional Eastern thought, especially in traditions like Taoism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Vedic Hinduism, we find a very different approach. Instead of breaking reality into fixed, mutually exclusive parts, these traditions see the world as an interconnected whole, fluid, relational, and alive. This is a kind of dynamic holism, a view that doesn't look for isolated substances, but for patterns of relationship, rhythms, and complementarities. Being and non-being are not absolute opposites, but aspects of a process that is always in motion. The difference is more than just conceptual. It's a difference in philosophical sensitivity. The West, starting with the pre-Socratics, has privileged the category of being. What is? What stays the same? What can be named and defined? Parmenides already said, being is, non-being is not. That line marked Western thought deeply, pushing it to distrust change, ambiguity, and emptiness. Knowledge came to be seen as the power to classify and control. This view hits its peak with Descartes, who separates the subject from the world and mind from matter. The human being becomes a thinking I, standing apart from nature, able to understand it as a kind of machine. Knowledge is then built through analysis, breaking things down into smaller pieces. Fragmentation becomes a method. In contrast, traditional Eastern thought works in other ways. The Tao Te Ching of Laozi already warns us. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Instead of chasing fixed definitions, Taoism invites us to watch the flows of nature, the interaction of opposites that don't cancel each other out, but complement each other. Yin and Yang are not enemies. They are balancing forces. Reality is not made of solid substances, but of relationships. Mahayana Buddhism, especially through thinkers like Nagarjuna, also tears down the idea of fixed essences. Whatever exists, exists only in dependence on other things. There is no thing in itself, only a web of co-arising. A flower depends on the soil, water, sunlight, time, space, and even on the observer. Everything is empty of its own independent nature, because everything exists in constant relation to everything else. This holistic way of seeing doesn't erase differences. It places them in a field of complementarity. Instead of this or that, Eastern thought often works with this and that. Contradictions don't always have to be solved. They can be lived with. What the West calls a paradox, the East often sees as part of the way reality actually is. This difference has ethical, ontological, and epistemological implications. In the West, the search for identity is central. To be is to be something defined. In the East, identity is more fluid. The self is not a substance, but a process. In Buddhism, anatta denies a permanent I. The Tao can't be owned. Knowledge is not only analytical, it is also intuitive, contemplative, experiential. In ethics, this creates very different styles. Western tradition, rooted in fixed categories like good and evil, tends to build universal moral codes. Eastern ethics is often tied to context, harmony, nonviolence, ahimsa, and non-attachment. The right action is not the one that follows an absolute rule, but the one that respects the balance of the moment. Still, it would be unfair to draw a hard line between West and East. The West itself has traditions that challenge substantialist dualism. Like Heraclitus, Neoplatonism, Christian mysticism, and modern currents such as phenomenology and deep ecology. Likewise, the East is not a single block. There are more essentialist schools, rigid rituals, and complex metaphysical systems, but the main tendency is clear. In the West, an ontology of substance. In the East, an ontology of process. Today, this contrast has new weight. The modern world, built on Western pillars of rationalism, technique, control, and analysis, is in deep crisis. The fragmentation of knowledge, the split between humans and nature, the collapse of grand narratives, all of this exposes the limits of a mindset that always divides in order to understand. Rising depression and anxiety, ecological breakdown, and a sense of meaninglessness all show the cost of a worldview that treats reality like a machine and the human being like a product. In this context, interest in Eastern thought has grown, not as an exotic fashion, but as an alternative way of knowing and living. Meditation, mindfulness, traditional medicine, the art of listening, integrated systems, all this points to a return to a more organic, interdependent, relational vision of life. Science itself is starting to talk with Eastern philosophy. Quantum physics recognizes that the observer participates in the phenomenon. Systems biology drops the old mechanistic model. Ecology demands a new way of being in the world. The core lesson of dynamic holism is that we are not islands. There is no me completely separate from the other. There is no nature separate from culture. Everything co-emerges. everything influences everything else. Everything transformed. Reality is not a thing, but a fabric. Not an object, but a field of relations. The challenge is to let go of the arrogance of control and learn again how to live in the world with humility, listening, and reverence. Western thought has its strength: conceptual clarity, analytical power, logical rigor. Eastern thought has its wisdom, sensitivity to the whole, respect for impermanence, an understanding of life as a dance. Instead of choosing one against the other, maybe this is the time for integration, dialogue, and creative synthesis, because being and non-being don't have to be enemies. Being can open itself to emptiness, substance can learn to dance with process, and reason can bow, not in defeat, but in awe, before what cannot be measured, only lived. If you made it this far, you have my sincere thanks. Walking through these ideas, these clashes and contrasts that shaped human thought, isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a journey of self-discovery and expanded awareness. It's an invitation to question, to reflect, and, above all, to feel the weight and the beauty of being alive in a world with so many possible meanings. If this video made you think, stirred up some doubt, or even challenged you, then it's already done its job. Now, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel so you can keep exploring more ideas that push past common sense and easy answers. Like the video. It really helps this channel reach more people who are searching, just like you. Comment below, which of these philosophical clashes hit you the hardest? Which side do you connect with more? Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. Share this video with someone who loves philosophy, history, or just enjoys thinking beyond the surface. And of course, stick around. There are many other videos waiting for you, with more philosophical showdowns, more intriguing stories, and more questions that may never have a final answer, but are absolutely worth asking. See you in the next video.